God of Trash, Cultivation LitRPG, by author noct chapter 141 to 157. Time passed. Their profits grew, and Rhys purchased the building outright, then started shopping for their next location. In the meantime, he had a few of his underlings build a second cart, then walk the streets with it and record their sales at each location they stopped at. The more they wandered the city, the more they learned about the best places for sales. As expected, anywhere near the mage school did well, but surprisingly, so did the areas near any gate, where the adult mages who worked day in, day out, doing gods knew what for the empire, could stop out and grab a quick salty snack. Honey started coming in, and Rhys started selling his weak potion soda. The students took to it like flies to, well, honey, while the adults were a little more reserved to it, unused to cooled beverages or sweet potions. Rhys frowned, thinking on it, then snapped his fingers as the answer came to him in a flash. Obviously. Adults liked soda, sure, but what did they need? What did they crave more than life itself? Coffee and energy drinks. For adults, flavor was secondary, the chemical effect on the body was far more important. So, he'd plunged back into the sewers, raided the library for potion books, and popped back out to practice stamina potions, concentrating them over and over again until the other mages made him practice outside, because the fumes were too fierce for them to focus anymore, and their hands wouldn't stop shaking. Lyra, a little more delicate to water vapors as a water sprite, insisted he not get too close to her, lest she start buzzing around the building. Using the concentrated stamina potion and the weak healing potion, Rhys developed a second drink with a higher concentration of active ingredients. It was more bitter than his soda, not carbonated, and meant to be served hot, cold, or iced, just like coffee. Lyra eyed the strange, brownish fluid from a distance as he wheeled it out for its first test run. "Are you sure about that? That stuff is downright toxic." "I know. Isn't it great?" Rhys replied enthusiastically. The potion was laden with traces of impurities, of course, but even better, it was the most trashy beverage available outside of cheap beer, an energy drink. Even if his victims, patrons, didn't get too badly impurified, they would still get physically and emotionally hooked on the energy drink. Serving it in the mornings would only cement his power over them, hooking them to using it to wake themselves up. Sure, mages didn't need to sleep, but plenty did it as a luxury, and even if they didn't, conditioning their bodies to expect a surge of energy in the morning every day meant he could count on them to have a zombie phase every morning when he rescinded his drinks. It was the perfect plan. He couldn't be more excited. "I'm not sure, great, is the right word," Lyra replied, crossing her arms skeptically. "You're strengthening the enemy." Rhys winked. "Exactly. I don't get you," she muttered, and walked away. "Sable hasn't said anything," Rhys called after her. Lyra shook her head in the distance. "But I'm listening." He nodded. With Lyra and Sable watching the tunnel, one of them a little more at a distance than the other, he could safely go peddle his new wares. He could still retreat to the shop if they sent an urgent summons and get there within a few minutes, so even in the worst case that the Water Syndicate finally stopped nickel and diming them and launched an all-out attack, he wasn't too far to help. Lyra and Sable were capable fighters, and that was totally discounting Mouse and everyone else in the store. All of them together could hold against almost anything in the superior defensive formation of the bottlenecked tunnel for the amount of time he would need to drop everything and run back. He really doubted that the Water Syndicate was going to stage a front-on attack, even after their first attempted attack which ended in failure. At the end of the day, the Water Syndicate was a criminal enterprise, in the Empire, where the Empress kept calm and civility with an iron fist. If they acted aggressive, they'd get slapped down, just the same as Rhys and his people would if the Empress became aware of them. It benefited both of them to keep things under wraps, underground, if you would, so he had no reason to expect anything but for them to attack through the tunnel. True, the more siblings he killed, the more likely they were to launch a more risky full frontal attack. As he slowly aggravated them more and more, Rhys pursed his lips. That was no good. He hadn't considered that angle. People driven into a corner could do crazy things, and he was inadvertently driving them into a corner. Then, Maybe next time, we take the initiative, Rhys thought to himself. There was no reason to keep allowing the Water Syndicate to decide when and where their battles were fought. He, too, could control the time and place of battle. All he needed was a little creative questioning, and he was pretty sure he had plenty of levers to pull to make the truth come out, as it were. In fact, he could even go question one of his good farm workers, but that was a stone too far for him. Sure, he could casually ask around, but pressuring or torturing them was right out. Using a little creative aggression on a fighter in the heat of battle to coerce the location of the enemy base out of them was one thing, still reprehensible but not utterly disgusting. Attacking those who had surrendered out of nowhere. No, that was too far. Even Rhys had to draw the line somewhere, and that was where he drew his. He might be in his villain era, but he wasn't bad to the bone, and he really didn't want to do anything he couldn't proudly tell Bast about later. Now, it was true that, proudly tell Bast, wasn't much of a line, given Bast's proclivities and general lack of care about all kinds of violence, but it was still a line. And it was important to have lines in life. He thought all this as he pushed his cart along, heading out to where the fry cart was parked. The first one was still parked in front of the kitchen, but he'd moved the second to a place where lots of adult mages frequented, near the tall, featureless buildings he'd come to realize were this world's, or maybe the Empire's, version of office buildings. A few mages stood in line at the fry cart. At this hour, there weren't too many of them, but there were still more than zero, which was victory to Rhys. He drew up alongside the fry cart, tossing his frontmen a smile, then started hawking his wares. Delicious coffee. Get a perk in the morning. Tired. Sleepy. Have a delicious pick-me-up in a cup. Hot or cold, it's delicious either way. Morning coffee. It wasn't coffee, and it was honestly disrespectful to coffee to call it coffee, but there was nothing he could do about that. He hadn't seen any coffee beans, and while the world was large and it had tomatoes, so it probably had coffee somewhere, it probably had them somewhere far away from here. In any case, the absence of coffee beans was actually an advantage. Some enterprising young fellow would have certainly discovered them and created some kind of potion or brew out of them if they were in the area, but since there were no coffee beans to be found, these people would be totally taken aback by the idea of an energizing drink. Well, not totally taken aback. Stamina potions were a thing, after all. His real pioneering move here wasn't developing something new, but marketing it differently. Just like a certain fruit-based technology company, he had nothing to share that other companies hadn't already developed, and the specs on his potion were honestly pretty watered down and weaker than actual stamina potions. But, just like a certain fruit-based technology company, he was selling it as something new and exciting, something that was truly groundbreaking. It was a drink, not a potion. You didn't take it when you were deficient, you took it when you wanted a boost and a refreshing sip. All he had left to do was get people hooked on the brand, then raise the price, so they were locked into drinking his not coffee and had to pay the higher price for his lower quality goods. It's not exactly like the tech world. I can't exactly lock them in, Rhys knew, since with tech, one could deliberately build an entire ecosystem that deliberately didn't work with anything else, then sell it as better. Somehow, he'd never bought into that particular scam, and didn't understand why anyone did, when he was looking in from outside. With drinks, on the other hand, all he needed was for one person to unlock a formula somewhat like his and sell it at a lower price, and he'd lose a significant percentage of sales. Sure, people would still buy into the scam. People went out of their way to purchase Starbucks. After all, when all that coffee had going for it was the prestige, but he wouldn't get the same degree of lock-in one could with technology. Rather, once competition showed up, he'd have to head directly into the 1930s, and do all the competition things outlawed in his world, like, for example, taking massive losses to offer a product at an unsustainable price, knowing that once all the other businesses went bankrupt and he dominated the market, he could raise prices again to make up for it. It wasn't good for the Empire's economy, writ large, but that was just a bonus, as far as Rhys was concerned. A haggard-looking mage stumbled over and handed Rhys some coins. He traded them for a trash paper mug, and the man sipped it, eyes rimmed by dark bags, his face pale. As the stamina drink rushed into him, he took a deep breath. The dark bags receded some, and color came back to his face. He looked at the cup, then at Rhys, and nodded in appreciation before staggering off. Rhys smiled, then looked down at his hands. What was that? A skill had activated without his acknowledgement, one he had never expected to activate outward at all. Less is more. It had flared when the man had sipped the stamina potion, and Rhys had briefly sensed the stamina drink growing more potent for the split second of that first sip. Less is more can activate on others. He hadn't expected that. Wait, but then, did that mean he could use less poison to inflict more damage? Fewer impurities to cause greater gunk? No, he'd already known that, but doing it without having to attack. Until now, he'd actively drank something, or actively stabbed someone, then used less is more. But this, he simply handed a man a cup, and the skill still pumped up the stamina-boosting effect of the drink. Rhys rubbed his forehead as the full magnitude of this new discovery hit him. Inflicting less is more on others was incredible. He could kill with a trickle of weak poison in a cup of drink that his opponent would think was too weak to harm them, and save lives with a single swallow of potion administered close to him, without him even visibly intervening. As the next customer approached, Rhys paid close attention to less is more, pasting a big smile on his face. How far could he affect them from? How much could he affect them? How well could he target this new external skill? As the mages slurped down their stamina drinks, Rhys almost forgot to collect their coins, he was so focused on the activations of less is more. Almost. He still collected his gold. Gold was more important than anything else, except maybe overthrowing the Empire, and even that could be accomplished with enough gold. He was just trashy enough to know he could purchase his happiness, if by happiness he meant the downfall of the Empire. The more he watched, the more he understood. Less is more could reach outside of his body, but not far, only a 5-foot radius or so, at best. He couldn't target its abilities, in other words, he couldn't make the impurities worse without making the potion better an equal amount. On the other hand, he could push more mana into the skill to make it activate more strongly, though less is more was always kind of funky with receiving more of anything, and at the end of the day, he wasn't sure if he'd actually activated it more strongly by giving it more mana, or if it was simply that the mage in question had sipped it more gently, meaning that less is more had activated stronger as a result, and the mana he'd input was meaningless. A little voice in his mind whispered, that one's probably more correct. Still, he could rein it in or even turn it off entirely. Not for himself, but for the outside his body effect. He didn't have to go around making sure he only used a little bit of poison on someone for it to be most effective, but if he only had a little poison, he could turn it on to make it more effective. It was a somewhat irrelevant ability, since he could also take a single step back and remove his target from the skill's pitiful external range, but it was worth noting anyways. Better to know the limitations of his skill than to be in the dark. Though, now that he was thinking about it, less is more was both his first skill, and the skill he knew the least about. For the most part, it was intuitive, the less he took of something, the more effect it had. But what did it mean? What were its limits? How did it play into trash? These were all things he hadn't really investigated. Rhys pinched his chin. He'd been too busy using it to survive to investigate it thoroughly at first. Later on, he'd focused more on his trash aspects and other parts of his path, and neglected his first skill. Sure, it still came in handy every now and again, but it was a minor passive buff, the kind easily disregarded in any game system. Is there something more to it? It was his first skill. In a certain way, if he allowed a tiny amount of religious fervor to settle over him, he could see it as absolute existence's only hint, though a part of him considered that absolutely ridiculous. It was equally likely that it was simply a random skill he'd gathered thanks to licking up drops of potion, and it being his first was because he'd been acting strange, not because it was some kind of cosmic hint. Was it vitally important, or the result of fucking around and finding out a positive thing, for once? Given my tendencies, more likely the latter than the former. A god wouldn't give trash like him a special ultimate skill. Cheat skills were the property of heroes, not talentless trash. Bast probably had one, but him. Nah. Less is more was just some trash skill, but it was a nice trash skill, and he was proud of it for being wonderful, useful, delicious trash. Still, it never hurt to learn more about trash. He'd certainly never hesitated to dive into a big, steaming pile of trash, literal or literary. Why stop now? He was running low on coffee when a quiet ping of mana caught his attention. The first haggard mage he'd served was still lingering around, perhaps seeking another sip like his first hit. Rhys handed the guy the rest of the vat and ran. Give it to the fry shop when you're done. The haggard man blinked after Rhys. He stared after Rhys for a long second with his dead eyes, then slowly raised the vat to his lips and slurped. Rhys ran through the streets. Like the trash skill it was, trash step activated intermittently, surging him ahead when he stepped on uneven ground or ran past a pile of trash. Rhys appeared to race ahead smoothly, then stutter back to an ordinary run every time the footing changed. He was used to it, but to the outside eye, it appeared as if his movement technique were fragile, and only worked occasionally. Not that Rhys minded, better if people thought he was a weak mage with a pathetic, semi-operational movement skill, rather than a Tier 3 mage. For all that, he made it back to the shop in record speed, rushing inside to throw himself down the trap door, then sprint all out in the trashy dirt footing to close in on the battle. He could already hear it, the distinctive sound of steel on bone resonating down the tunnel. The muddy footing told him Lyra was down in the tunnel, too, and yet they'd still called for his help. Whoever they were fighting, had to be quite powerful. Was the next sibling that much of a jump in power? Or was it that more than one had showed up this time? They had already killed 2 siblings, after all. If it was Rhys's battle, he'd send 2 next time, if only so one could escape and tell everyone where all their fighters were vanishing off to. Of course, he had no intention of letting anyone escape, but it was how he'd play it, if he were on the offensive side of this battle. A white blur rushed toward him, hurtling down the tunnel. Rhys reached out his arms and snatched Lyra out of the air, catching her in a sodden lump. In his mind's eye, she swooned in his arms, touched his chin, and desperately gasped for help, but in real life, she did a flip turn and kicked off of him, directly back into battle. Rhys blinked, watching her go. She spun around the corner in a column of water, and the sound of fierce battling came from the other side. You're welcome. Shaking his head, he ran after her, drawing his broken sword as he ran. He turned the corner and found a melee. Dozens of underlings, far more than ever before, poured down the tunnel, pushing even Sable with her extra limbs to the limit. Lyra assisted with crowd control, sending columns of water hurtling into the underlings to push them back. Honestly, the 2 of them struggled, but they held the line. The problem was the stronger mages, the 2 men who had the same kind of face as Logan and Lloyd. One was slender, with a narrow chin and thin shoulders, while the other had broad shoulders and huge muscles, plus a squared chin, but the rest of their faces were very similar. The muscular one stood at the front of the mess of underlings, hammering at Sable's limbs at this very moment, while the slender one stood at the back, waving a fan that emitted strange light. Every time it emitted a new light, the underlings changed, whether they grew stronger, weaker, enraged, or calm. They moved with unusual coordination for a mob of criminals, too, as if someone were controlling them with a fan that emitted multicolored light. Rhys snorted. He charged toward the battle, and the muscular man shoved away from Sable and barreled toward him. A mad grin stretched across his face. You look strong. Rhys hopped the man's bear hug, leaving a handprint of impurities on the man's shoulder in return. The big guy stumbled, and Rhys hopped over the underlings to close in on the slender man with the fan. The slender man widened his eyes and jumped back, lifting the fan high. As he waved it, sending a beam of light hurtling at Rhys, he shouted, Larry, you fool. You're supposed to keep him pinned down. He's too fast, Leonard. Larry shouted back. Your family had a theme, huh, Rhys muttered. 1 was meaningless, 2 was a theme, 3 was a pattern and 4 was an obsession. It was strange how their family had known these siblings would all be taking the L, but hey, Rhys had to respect the hustle. At least they knew what they were about, and he certainly couldn't agree more that they were all big L's. He ducked, but Leonard shifted his fan lazily, and the beam fell on him. Instantly, rage filled Rhys's heart. He wanted nothing more than to beat Larry's face in, with his bare hands, if possible. So he rushed forward, and punched Leonard in the face. Leonard staggered back, clutching a broken, bleeding nose. "Why? The spell affected you. The fastest way to fight him is to beat you first," Rhys told him, closing the distance and hooking a leg behind Leonard's. Leonard stumbled, and Rhys swept his feet. The skinny man hit the ground hard, but clung onto the fan. Rhys chased him down, tossing the sword aside to beat the man with his bare fists. Leonard smacked him with the fan, and the rage left him, replaced with a serene calm. In his calmer state, Rhys realized two things. 1. That Leonard was not very strong on his own, and 2. That the man was a bit of a coward, crying through his broken nose even now, and that he'd probably break pretty easily if he threatened violence. Instead of continuing to beat the man, he jumped up and instantly kicked the man's hand, kicking and stomping until Leonard released the fan. He kicked the fan across the tunnel. Leonard whirled and threw himself after the fan, only for Rhys to make a grabbing gesture. As Leonard reached out, two bony hands pushed through the earth to form a cage of bone around him. He threw himself against the bars of the bones, reaching as far as he could. His fingertips scraped the fan. Rhys picked the fan up. He wafted it a bit, fanning himself, then turned to face Larry, who was still facing off against Sable while Lyra played crowd control. He waved the fan, willing it to weaken Larry. A beam of dark purple light shot out and fell on Larry. Instantly, Rhys felt a strong pull on his mana. He raised his brows, shocked at how much mana the tool took. Did Leonard have a huge mana pool, or was his talent with tools just that bad, that he had to use serious quantities of mana to keep up the skill? Either way, it wasn't something he could casually use the way Leonard did. On the other side of the room, Larry stumbled as he suddenly weakened. Sable instantly crawled over him, climbing up his chest and onto his back with her blade-tipped limbs. With each step, her limbs plunged into his flesh, leaving bloody wounds behind. Larry reached for her, but sluggishly, unable to keep up with her quick movements now that Rhys had weakened him. Sable's tail darted forth a dozen times, stabbing his thick back over and over. Purple fluid leaked out behind it, and his body instantly began to shrivel from the poison in her tail. Lyra blasted all the unempowered underlings with water, knocking them to the ground. Larry roared. He reached over his shoulder and threw Sable off, tossing her into the wall. She struck with a meaty thump and tumbled to the ground. His body swelled, changing shape. Fur pushed out of his skin, he leaned forward, and his muscles bulged further, threaded with thick veins. He charged like a gorilla, running on his knuckles, and pushed directly through his underlings, sending them flying. Rhys barely had time to look up before a monstrous wall of flesh closed in on him, tutu thumping over the wet ground. Oh, shit. He threw himself back and away, but he wasn't fast enough to completely dodge. Larry ducked his shoulder and smashed Rhys into the wall, pinning him there with his muscular body. Blow mitigation took some of the hit, but not enough. Pain slammed through Rhys, and he felt the sickening sensation of at least one broken bone. His vision flickered, and only trash body activating kept him awake. The glorified Larry roared in his face, opening his mouth wide. Rhys giggled. "Oh no, you squeezed the burps out of me." He spat a ball of compressed trash gas directly into Larry's roaring mouth. Larry pulled back his arm, ignoring Rhys, then gagged. He staggered backward, clutching his throat. His eyes widened, and he opened his mouth, trying to scream, only to find that his throat was already melting away. Down into the lungs, the heart, the chest cavity, Rhys could trace the corrosive gas as it passed through Larry's body by the strong lump of impurities within it. Larry gagged a few more times, then fell back, no longer moving. Rhys stumbled over, giving Larry a kick. He turned toward the rest of the fight, barely staying on his feet. His mana was low from the fan, and now he was badly injured, thanks to Larry. His whole body wanted to sleep and rejuvenate. Even now, he was only standing thanks to Trash body. He could feel a bone grinding in his leg, but somehow he could stand on it. At Tier 3, Trash body was truly an impressive skill. The underlings stared in abject horror at Rhys, who'd just beaten their 2 bosses and looked like a zombie, yet still stood, while Lyra and Sable just stared. "Make sure you don't let Leonard get away," Rhys told them, and passed out. Rhys blinked awake, then sat up. He laid on the floor of the 2nd story of the tavern, in someone's bedroll. As mages, they didn't really need to sleep, and as a result, they didn't have beds. It was an expense they could afford to skip. The bedroll he laid in smelled strongly of must and mildew, as if it hadn't seen the sun in a long time, and instead spent a long time in the bottom of someone's storage ring, or maybe in a garbage pit. Rhys idly sucked in all the impurities on the bedroll, then climbed to his feet, brushing down his robes. He looked around. "What am I doing here? What's going on?" He thought back. The last thing he remembered was the coffee. No, that wasn't it. He'd run to the tunnel, and the battle, Larry and Leonard. Rhys patted down his robes, then checked his storage ring. A fancy new fan sat there, ready for him to use it, sell it, or throw it away. He breathed a sigh of relief. If nothing else, at least he'd stripped Leonard of his weapon before passing out. He drew the fan out and fanned himself idly, not activating the spell on it, least of all because he wasn't sure his trash star could handle another usage. He hadn't really used magical artifacts until this moment. He hadn't had the chance to. The few he'd found in the trash were, well, trash. A thrown-away storage ring. Items of that magnitude, that took so little mana to activate that almost every Tier 1 mage from a reasonable background would have one from childhood. Today, for the first time, he'd used a high-level, complex, powerful magical artifact. The kind a criminal syndicate would prize and give to its higher command. And it had nearly wiped him out. The trash star was still burning, but weakly. It was on its last legs, desperately in need of an infusion of trash. He was pretty sure the fan wasn't supposed to take that much mana. It was just that his talent at handling magical artifacts was so trash that it took such a huge toll on him in particular. The Crimson Flare Orb hadn't taken so much mana to activate, but then, it was essentially a mana battery for a big weapon he didn't own. Of course it didn't take much mana to activate, it was a thing that held mana, not a thing that required mana to activate. From a way of looking at it, the fan was the weapon that the battery, the orb, was supposed to slot into. It wasn't, but that was the difference in the 2 artifacts. One held mana that was supposed to be supplied to something else, which was currently powering his oil pots, and the other was the thing that mana was supposed to be supplied to. The 2 weren't compatible, because the fan didn't take fire mana, and the Crimson Flare Orb wasn't subtle enough to change its output to match what the fan desired, but hypothetically, as he'd touched on earlier, the 2 were the 2 pieces to the puzzle. The battery and the toy dog, except one of them was a D battery and the other was a drawing pen that required quadruple A batteries. After all, if the Crimson Flare Orb didn't output power, Logan couldn't have used it to pretend to be Tier 2. The fan, on the other hand, had been used by a proper Tier 2. That was the most critical difference, the most important thing about the 2 of them. He gave the fan a wistful look, then hung it on his belt with a sigh. He could always give it to someone more suited to it. It was a pity that using magical artifacts on his tier or higher wasn't in his immediate future, at least as long as they weren't trash, but he had plenty of subordinates who could use a powerful weapon or 2. For now, he needed to go find whatever his underlings had done to Leonard. He had a few questions for the guy, and some creative force to apply. Rhys climbed down from the loft/second floor where they slept/meditated when it was nighttime and they decided to rest, rather than keep going, because at their core they were still monkeys with circadian rhythms, and found the kitchen bustling with motion. Even without him there, everything continued to move. Chips got cooked. Fries got fried. One particularly industrious mage was even attempting to make his coffee, and the attempt wasn't bad. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't have the same magic, informal, without less is more, but it should do the trick in a pinch. Lyra and Sable looked up as he walked in, Lyra chuckling and Sable turning away as if she didn't care. "Good morning, Princess," Lyra greeted him. She thumbed over her shoulder at the rapidly vanishing Sable. "She was all worried about you, you know. Wouldn't leave your side. I had to go and just about pull her away from your side just to get her in the kitchen, and you know Sable never goes to the kitchen." Rhys glanced after her. "Really? Why? Oh, does she feel guilty because I got hurt in her presence?" No need for those air quotes. You really were quite hurt. Even I was a little scared when potions didn't do much for you, but your regeneration skill kicked in while you were sleeping. Didn't know you had one of those, incidentally, thanks for sharing. Yeah, 'cause you share all your skills, Rhys snarked back. Next time, just give me little dribbles of potion. It'll help more. Lyra squinted at him. Are you afraid of potions, or something? Mr. Trashman is afraid of a few little impurities from a little potion. Rhys reached into his robes, only for his hand to come up empty. The Empire had taken all the impurity potions he had on him, and the special one, the one he'd needed a particularly resilient bottle to handle, was hidden with the sun sword underground. He lowered his hand, then shrugged. Not the impurities. I just have a weird set of skills that's optimized that way. Anyways, let Sable know it's not her fault. We're all combatants. If I, or she, gets hurt in the line of duty, that's just the price of doing business. Oh, yeah, that's what's bothering her. You haven't noticed that she likes you, Birdbrain. Don't be ridiculous. I'm trash. Sable deserved someone fitting of her status and stature, not a trash gremlin like Rhys. She doesn't think so. And more's the pity. Hey, Lyra, where's our guest? The one I captured with the bone hands, Rhys clarified. Lyra pointed down. Where you left him. That spell didn't deactivate when you passed out. It didn't. Well, it's a curse, right? Curses aren't known for being easy to dispel, Lyra pointed out. Huh. Rhys had to admit she had a point. Curses were virulent, nasty things, known for hanging out long past when their caster wanted them to go away. He hadn't been thinking of the bone hands like a curse, but now that he was, of course they'd stay around. He probably had to do some ritual to dispel them, or would, anyways, if he wasn't a ball of curses and trash himself. He nodded at Lyra. Thanks. I'll be right back. Lyra nodded and turned away, then glanced back at the last second. Oh, we sent Mouse down there, since he harassed anyone else. Since she's, you know, partially invisible, was peacefully reading the last I saw her, with poor Leonard moping in his cage. Good call, Rhys replied. He turned away, frowning at himself as he did. He was starting to forget Mouse, when she wasn't immediately around or directly in his vision. Lyra had a reason to remind him about Mouse, and even then, it had been an afterthought, almost forgotten. Mouse's blend-in skill was getting slightly ridiculous. It was as though she were wiping herself directly from the universe, rather than merely going unseen. True, it wasn't at that extreme yet, nowhere near, but he could see the future where she simply vanished. Not just from the eye or mana senses, but from people's perception and memory as well, where she was an unseen, unfelt, unknown existence that barely existed at all. He ran a hand through his hair, a little terrified. What kind of monster have I created? By giving her a little nudge toward her path, he'd helped her transform from a shy wallflower, to someone the ever-vigilant Empire ignored for years, to someone who he'd personally had trouble remembering, even when he was reminded about her. If she didn't want to be seen, she could even sit quietly right beside her victim, and they wouldn't acknowledge her in the least. A shiver ran up his spine. It's a good thing she's on our side. If she was on the Empire's side, there'd be nothing they could do, the battle would already be lost. Fortunately, Mouse wasn't much of a combatant, though a tiny bit of Rhys, the part of him that was less concerned with his personal safety and more worried about optimizing everything, really wanted to see what kind of a monster he could create by teaching her proper sword form, or better yet, how to stab someone quietly in the back for a one-hit kill. Her skills were more than ideal for an assassin. In fact, she would be an insanely powerful assassin, what with being able to entirely erase herself. Then again, maybe that's just the baseline expectation for assassins. Mouse had been utilized by a spy by her school already, so maybe she was just an average skill for someone pursuing the hidden route. On the other hand, he was pretty sure her skill also made her school overlook her, so he doubted they'd been utilizing her to her full extent, or even, necessarily, realized what a valuable unit they had at hand. The real question is, how did I get so lucky? Rhys wondered. A moment later, it came to him. Mouse was throwing herself away. She wasn't hiding to grind her skill, or grow more powerful. She earnestly, from the bottom of her heart, wanted to be left alone and ignored, not utilized. Her whole existence was defined by hiding away from society and ducking every possible social advancement, or, in other words, by throwing away her future as a powerful assassin to hide in a corner and read books instead. Rhys respected it. Hell, he dreamed of such an ideal existence many times in his youth and adulthood and sometimes even now, but society didn't. A life spent idly was a life wasted, said society. Thus, Mouse was trash, and thus, she had fallen into his hands. Rhys dropped down into the tunnels. Sable was there, but at the sight of him, she scuttled onto the ceiling, into a particularly dark crevasse, and sat there, not looking at him or saying anything. Rhys glanced at her, then snorted and walked on. If she wanted to be left alone, he'd leave her alone. He wasn't delusional like Lyra, thinking she might like him. Someone else had suggested it too, or maybe it was just Lyra. Either way, she was clearly projecting her own romantic hopes onto Sable and Rhys. There was nothing between them. They'd barely exchanged greetings. Around the corner, he came upon a seated mouse, buried in a book as he'd been promised, and his own curse. The bony hands still thrust up from the earth, and in their grasp, they held a haggard and frustrated Leonard. He perked up at the sight of Rhys and leaned forward, gripping the bones that barred him in. "Let me go. You have no right to hold me here. And you have no right to attack us, so that makes two of us," Rhys pointed out, without skipping a beat. Mouse looked up at Rhys's voice and shut her book, quickly scurrying out of the scene. Rhys watched her go, making a note to chase after her and give her more trainings later, then turned back to Leonard. He smiled sweetly. "Do you know where you are? In my family's tunnels, which you've rudely stolen from us, the rightful owners. I highly doubt you have the requisite permits to burrow under the city." "No, that's not correct. Where you are, is in my hands." Rhys gestured, knitting his fingers together, and the bones shifted, changing their grasp to grip Leonard a little tighter, just as Rhys's fingers knitted a little more tightly. Leonard ducked in the cage, edging away from the cold bone. "So, it's a creepy cage, but it's not a cage at all. In fact, it's a curse that's meant to kill. In fact, it's taking significant willpower to keep those hands from bearing you down into the cold earth right now," Rhys informed him. It was a bit of a lie. This close to the curse, he could, in fact, feel its desire to bear the man to his untimely death, but that was all. He didn't feel any overbearing desire to see this to its end. He could stand here all day, or leave Leonard caged for another dozen days, and it wouldn't change a thing. But it did apply a little bit of pressure, and he didn't mind that at all. Leonard started to sweat. "This isn't a curse. It can't be. It can, and it is." Rhys dragged the stool Mouse had been sitting on over and sat atop it. He desperately wanted it to be a chair, so he could sit on it backward and fold his hands over the top like those cool teachers and detectives in trashy movies, but it was only a stool, so he had to settle for a smarmy smirk and a lean forward, hands on his hips. "So what do you say, Leonard? You know what I want, the location of your base. We can do this the easy way, or the hard way. It's all up to you." Sweat dripped down Leonard's forehead. He glanced at the fan dangling from Rhys's belt, and swallowed. All at once, he opened his mouth. "To the northeast," Leonard burst out. Rhys blinked. He hadn't expected it to be this easy. Was Leonard lying? "Well, it doesn't matter. I have enough men to verify without going myself." Rhys reached into his robes and drew out a trashy book he'd been reading, presenting the rear leaves, the empty pieces of paper at the end of the book, and a pen. "A map, please. Is this all you need? Am I free to go?" Leonard asked, accepting both. Rhys shrugged. I haven't seen the map yet, have I? I'm not good with pain. I don't want to die, Leonard murmured, almost to himself. He glanced at Rhys, then back at his map, and grimaced. You'd better kill all of them. I don't want them coming after me. Worry about me coming after you right here, right now, then about your family, Rhys advised him, desperately wishing he had his backward chair for his villain act. There was nothing cool or villainous about sitting on a stool. He felt like a granny squatting by her grandchild's side to hold his hand, or a grandpa lugging around the old easy sit to a school football game. A moment later, he paused. Did you just tell me to kill your family? Leonard glanced at him. Better you than them, at this point. You seem like the kind to give a quick death, as you did to Larry. That was, Rhys raised his brows, startled. Apparently their scales were totally different when it came to painful deaths. He personally ranked, melted from the inside out by toxic gas pretty high on the scale of deaths he didn't want to personally experience, but clearly he was the fool here. In this world, clearly they didn't stop at toxic gas immolation. There was a near-infinite realm of further, more painful deaths beyond organs melting while you still lived, and Rhys didn't want to know anything about it. He nodded slowly. I'll take that under consideration. Plus, my family never gave a fuck about me, Leonard grumbled. Family this, family that, go clean the stable, you skinny fuck. You'll never amount to anything, because you like to read and actually learn about the world instead of wandering the countryside fucking idiot maidens and sucking down strength potions. Fuck 'em. I'm not gonna get tortured to death by some clown maniac for them. Rhys clicked his tongue, shaking his head. First off, it's maniac clown, thanks. Secondly, yeah, clowns. What do you think? Fuck clowns, Leonard spat, with almost more feeling than he'd just put into dressing down his family. I know, right? Why do fast food places love them so much? I don't get it either. Rhys pushed off his knees and stood. If you keep cooperating like this, I really have no problem setting you free. I could even look into putting you in charge of a farm. Farming. Leonard pulled a face. Don't knock it before you try it. It's a lot of sitting around doing nothing, since my rats, my underlings do it all. Lots of time to read and learn. Leonard harumphed. They don't allow non-military mages to access the library. I only hung around my family because they had a contact who could smuggle a few books out a year. There's no way you can. Oh, the library. Rhys reached into his storage ring and pulled out a half-dozen tomes. He occasionally wandered the sewer path back to the library, sucking up filth and retrieving whatever tomes the mages under his care wanted while he was there. He couldn't find everything, and he often had to bring Mouse along to access the more secure regions of the library, but thanks to Mouse's semi-invisibility and Rhys's unmitigated sewer access, they basically had full access to the entire selection of tomes. Leonard's eyes bulged. How? Rhys flourished his hands, sending the tomes back into his storage ring. Well, we'll negotiate that later. For now, you can stay in there. In the curse. You're kidding. This thing could kill me at any moment. Leonard snarled. I know. I'm the one controlling it, Rhys informed him. Leonard squinted. He'd finished his doodling on the map, and now stood there, pen and map held loosely in one hand. I sense no curse power on you. Yeah, I turn it on and off. You know how it is, Rhys said with a shrug. He took the pen and map back from Leonard, checking it to see if things made sense. The area Leonard circled was a part of the nearby mountains Rhys had never been to, so it was a possible hideout. That didn't mean it was what Leonard said it was, but it was at least worth checking. In other words, not a place that Rhys could immediately count out as being their hideout. You can't turn it on and off. It's a taint on your very core, your soul, your being. Even if you swap cores, curse power will be sunk deep into your body. Guess I'm just built different, Rhys interrupted him, smirking as wide as the horizon. He waved his hand and walked off. I'll see you in a bit. If you keep cooperating, full access to the library is within your options. He wasn't foolish enough to let Leonard loose before they beat the guy's family. For all he complained about them, family was still family, even abusive family. If he'd been abused his whole life, there was every possibility they'd abuse him right back into the place he'd tried to escape from. He'd seen it happen, back in his first life, with friends who deserved so much better. Knowing that they were being treated like shit and realizing that they were in an abusive relationship didn't stop people from going back to their abusive families and boyfriends, even if it was dead obvious they should simply avoid them from the outside of the relationship. Whatever forces were keeping them there in the first place, would put them right back in it, as long as they remained close to those people. Even if Leonard was dead serious about everything he'd said, there was nothing he could do to make Rhys trust him, because of the dynamics of those relationships. Plus, Rhys wasn't dumb enough to think someone who changed allegiances so easily and tactically would immediately give their whole lives to fight for his cause. If Leonard's family, or worse, the Empire, threatened him, there was every possibility that Leonard would jump ship just as fast as he'd hopped on Rhys's ship. At best, Rhys figured, he'd wait until after the battle, then stick Leonard on some distant, low-yield farm that wouldn't harm their operations even if the Empire were to completely demolish it. Just like Leonard had yielded to him, he would yield to the next source of power or threat of pain, and Rhys had no illusions about that. He was fundamentally someone Rhys couldn't trust. Still, any port in a storm, and any help against the Empire was worth it. Menial, low-trust tasks still needed to be done. Might as well put someone he couldn't trust on a near-useless task if he could afford it. He headed back up to the tavern, pretending to ignore Sable flinching back into the darkness as he passed. "Keep an eye on Leonard," he requested. There was no reply, but he knew she'd heard him by the dry skitter of bone on the ceiling. Back in the tavern, he turned to Mouse. "Here, can you scout out this location and let me know what's going on here?" Mouse took the map and looked it over, then looked at Rhys. Why? You're the one best suited to scouting." "Not, why me, why?" she clarified. "Why are we checking out what's here?" Rhys nodded at the floor. "Leonard said that's where his family is. I don't outright trust him, but there's no reason not to check it out, especially with your advanced stealth skills. I don't want you to fight, just take a peek and run away." "Advanced stealth skills," Mouse squeaked, pointing at herself. I mean, your natural tendency to be overlooked," Rhys clarified. Thinking back on it, when she'd been trying to be stealthy, he and Bast had caught her right away. It was only when she was hanging back, being a wallflower, and blending in that she was able to so easily wipe her entire self from existence. "I don't know what you're talking about," Mouse murmured, fading in on herself even where she stood. "Yeah, that's it. Do you want Lyra to come along, in case a fight breaks out?" Mouse looked shocked. "What about you?" "Me? What do you mean?" She glanced around, then leaned in. At a whisper, she said, "You'll be the only real fighter left behind." Rhys snorted. "I'm our only tier 3. I'm deliberately staying behind in case this is a trap. If someone attacks, I can handle it." "Are you sure?" He nodded. "I'm sure." "Then, I'd like Lyra. But you won't be in danger, right?" No. Mouse hesitated another beat, then glanced at Rhys. "Do I have to talk to her?" Rhys put a hand over his mouth, barely muffling a laugh. Too cute. There was something innately adorable about Mouse's shyness. Maybe it was just him, but the combination of glasses and shy and bookish was just too cute when it was all packaged together in one mousy-haired girl. He took a deep breath, stifled his laughter, and waved his hand. "Nah, I'll go talk to her." "Hey, Lyra." Mouse shrunk where she should. "You could have just said no." Lyra looked over from where she sat, lounging in one of their soda vats, before Rhys turned the water into soda. It wasn't very sanitary, but Rhys wasn't going to point that out. He'd have to charge more if he admitted it was gamer girl bath water, after all, and it was important that soda was cheap. Of course, he didn't really mind that Lyra kept lounging in his water. In his world, it wouldn't be very sanitary, but in this world, Lyra seemed to have a natural, low-level purification effect, And she could create new fresh water, besides, without them having to lug heavy vats back and forth from the streams, so it really worked out in his favor that she seemed to treat them like her personal tubs. She flicked her hair out of her face and raised a brow. Yeah, what? Mouse is gonna scout out the area Leonard pointed out for us. You mind going along to make sure she stays safe? Sure. I was getting bored here, anyways. Lyra hopped out of the water, executing a dynamic spin in midair, then landed and walked over, pulling out her umbrella with a casual flourish, as if she'd done it a million times before. Rhys resisted the urge to fist pump. Hell yeah. It was awesome when people did cool mage things for absolutely no reason at all. He was all for it. In a world where everyone was a top-tier acrobat, why not move with a bit of showiness every now and again? Remember, you're just scouting. Don't get in trouble. We'll come back with an actual attack force later, Rhys reminded them, or rather, Lyra in particular. He wasn't at all worried about Mouse going on the offensive randomly, but Lyra might. I'm not in a hurry to rush to my grave, Lyra said. She waved, putting a hand on Mouse's shoulder to escort her out through the tunnel. We'll be back before you know it. Rhys nodded. See ya. Mouse waved one last time, then ducked her head and followed Lyra into the trapdoor. A faint spark of worry appeared in Rhys's heart, but he quickly suppressed it. They'd just be stopping by for a glimpse, and Mouse's stealth techniques were far superior to anyone else's. They'd be fine. Definitely. For sure. For sure. He took a deep breath and looked after them. Surely this fear in his heart was unfounded. Surely. Rhys wandered through the sewers, absorbing trash as he went. This was close enough that he could return in a flash, but not so far that he had to worry about the others handling a member of the Water Syndicate alone. He sighed, a little frustrated. He wanted to go search for the Syndicate himself, but now that he had an establishment, he had to protect it, too. This is annoying. I need a better solution. He lifted his head, looking at the filth he sucked in. The sewers were pretty clean nowadays, with his constant efforts, but he was still just one guy, and he wasn't walking the sewers on the daily. There was enough filth to make it worth it. Still, it was diminishing each time, while his needs for trash grew greater. I need a way to get more trash. 2 problems. He sighed again, frustrated. What could he do? Something to gather more trash, to move instantaneously. The garbage truck, he said aloud, then laughed at his own joke. As funny as a garbage truck would be, they didn't exactly move instantaneously, or even quickly, since it wasn't as though he truly needed instantaneous movement. Rapid movement would be fine. Still, maybe there was something to that. Back at Infinite Constellation, he'd gone around collecting trash. In this city, let alone the Empire, that couldn't possibly be a solution. It was too large. If he spent all his time gathering trash, he wouldn't gain enough to make his efforts worth it. He needed something else. Something that congregated the trash, but more consistently than, whenever someone got annoyed enough to haul their junk to the garbage heap. That was far too slow. It was a good way for him to suck up historical trash, and, speaking of historical trash, he did fully intend to investigate the Empire for wherever it had thrown out those valuable artifacts that were inconvenient to its rule, but it was somewhat useless when it came to ongoing trash, or a constant rate of trash absorption. Especially with his trash fire, he was currently insatiable when it came to trash, or at least, close enough that it felt that way. He needed more and more trash. The Empire produced more than enough trash. It was absolutely filthy with garbage. Filth everywhere, piled up by every door. If he gathered it all, he'd have more than enough. Enough, even, to advance once more, if he was lucky. But how? That was the thing. How could he acquire all the trash produced in the Empire? The Empire was a vast thing, absolutely enormous. There was no way for him to manually gather all the trash in one place. Like he'd just thought, it would take way too long. He paused, the knee-deep water sloshing around him. Wait, there was something else. Something associated with the trash truck. Those ubiquitous bins, whether silver, black, green, or blue, and sometimes even exotic colors like yellow or purple. The humble, long-serving rubbish bin. The kind kept outside and rolled to the street every Sunday, or whenever the trash truck came by. What about those? Not a literal set of garbage bins. That would still require manual pickup, and though he could cobble together a trash service with his underlings, it wouldn't be worth it. They wouldn't be able to expand his chip empire, and since that was his real empire-toppling enterprise, that was more important than strengthening himself right now. After all, once the empire ate it, he could go back to happily leveling his own core, rather than his trash star, with no intercession by some bullshit repressive government. Thus, empire toppling took precedence over seeking strength. That didn't mean that he couldn't seek strength, or that he didn't intend to seek strength. No, he did, absolutely, but that he couldn't dismantle his current efforts to realign his people to something as selfish as strengthening himself. Then, what if they all just teleport garbage to me? Rhys said aloud. He walked on, continuing to absorb trash as he walked. He didn't have a teleportation technique, but he did have something like it, didn't he? Rhys touched his chest, where the little red book sat. The void. The hole in his core that led to the void let him store trash and mana on its far side, then absorb it back into himself. What if he connected all the trash cans to the part of the void near him, then absorbed the trash into his core from there? He was close to a breakthrough on the void. Connecting cans to the void should, probably be possible. He pursed his lips, then turned and walked back toward his base. He had to give this a try. It was too good an idea to ignore. Rhys took the sewers back to their old base. It was easier than heading to the shop, then routing around from the tunnel's exit to the base, and kept the two from being too obviously connected, too. New trash had been dropped off since he'd built the base, and he headed there now, in search of some raw materials. There wasn't anything in the trash as convenient as plastic, but there was plenty of pottery, wood, and scrap metal. Not enough metal, unfortunately, to forge metal trash cans, but wood and pottery, dirt and trees, in other words, if he thought about it that way. The wood scraps he considered closely, then brought together. Using his trash to vitality technique, he poured vitality into them, then urged the scraps to grow together. Some refused to respond, too far gone to ever come back, but others burst into life. They grew together, knitting into a big, woven bowl of sorts, almost like a basket, but sturdier, built of wood rather than scraps of grass and reeds. It wasn't ideal, somewhat misshapen and strange looking, but right now, he didn't need a perfect basket, just a good enough receptacle to test his void teleport technique on. Once he nailed that down, he could go back and start perfecting baskets, but given how this technique might even rip the basket directly into pieces, he wasn't going to spend too long forming it perfectly. He called the void to mind, diving into the depths of his core to come face to face with that gap once more. It was a slippery concept to hold in his head, but with some effort, he pinned it down. The void was emptiness. He couldn't grip emptiness any more than he could grip water, but he could hold it in a bucket, and he had a bucket right in front of him. He took the sensation of the void and poured it out, into the basket in front of him. Nothing happened. Rhys pursed his lips. He looked at his woven wood basket, then at his hands, then considered the void within himself once more. This isn't going to be easy, is it? Lyra glanced over her shoulder. Come on, Mouse. We're almost there. Mouse hung back, cringing in on herself. I don't know. This doesn't feel right. She lifted her head, glimpsing the world around her before she looked back down. It didn't feel right. Any of it. There was nothing wrong with the scenery. They stood at the mouth of a peaceful-looking ravine. A few deer stood nearby in the forest, chewing on the undergrowth, and birds sang from the trees. By all accounts, there was nothing wrong with this place. But something about it made Mouse's heart race, the same as standing in front of a crowd of people, or considering entering a busy party. It felt like 1,000 eyes would lock onto her the second she took another step. We're going to go up and around, anyways. Don't worry about it, Lyra assured her, lifting her skirts to hop up the wall of the ravine. Mouse looked after her. She hesitated another moment, then followed, but skirted around wide, wandering through the woods rather than walking on the edge of the ravine, as Lyra so boldly did. There were no mana signatures from within the ravine, but that in of itself was suspicious, since the ravine should be as full of life as the rest of the forest. The ravine being devoid of life was enough for Mouse to want to call it good enough and turn tail, run back to Rhys and tell him their findings, but no, Lyra had to know for sure what was within. Even Mouse knew that Lyra was right, and that this was their actual objective, but she instinctively didn't want to get any closer. Every fiber of her body screamed for her to back away and escape. Any closer, and they'd see her, but this was their goal. Lyra was right. She couldn't turn away yet. Mouse crept closer, sneaking from tree to tree, while Lyra wandered along, walking the edge. She glanced at Mouse and laughed. There's nothing to hide from, silly Mouse. You can walk in the sun. Mouse shook her head resolutely. You look like prey right now, Lyra warned her, shaking her head. Mouse froze, hesitating behind her chosen tree. Lyra sighed. That's not making you look less like prey. Come on out. No motion. Lyra tilted her head. Mouse. Who are you talking to, little water sprite? Lyra whipped around. A huge form loomed over her, cast to a silhouette by the sun beaming directly over their shoulder. They crossed their arms and shook their head. What are you doing, sneaking around out here? What? Is a water sprite not allowed to wander in the woods? It's like you've never seen a water sprite before, Lyra snapped, immediately going on the offensive. From where she stood, hunkered behind her tree, Mouse didn't miss the way Lyra's hand tightened on her umbrella's handle. She was scared, as she should be. Mouse couldn't sense the figure's power level, which meant they were at least a tier stronger than her, if not two. All she knew was that they felt immensely powerful. Even more powerful than Rhys. Not in the Empire. Are you a soldier, then? She challenged them. A laugh. I'm not going to report you, no. I'm no cop. Lyra went to shove past them. Then good day. A hand clasped her shoulder. But I have to know. Why are you sniffing around our base? Sniffing. I was just walking through the forest. You're the one who jumped out of nowhere and grabbed my shoulder. You're being very rude, you know. There was a long pause. The shadowy figure looked down at Lyra, and Lyra stared defiantly back. After a moment, they lifted a hand to their chin. I suppose, are you really just a wild water sprite who happened to take the wrong path? Wrong path. I wasn't aware there was a wrong way through the forest. Isn't this land uninhabited? It belongs to no one, Lyra asserted. The voice scoffed. Or that's what you thought I'd say. It kicked off the forest floor, and their enormous body blurred out of sight. Behind her tree, Mouse hunkered. She clasped her hands over her head and squeezed her eyes shut, desperately wishing to not exist at all. I'm not here, I'm not here, I'm not here. A massive paw wrapped around the trunk. A shadow fell over Mouse. She froze, crouched down, holding completely, utterly still, as if she were a statue. Mana rushed through the space in a wave, far greater than she could ever overcome, and washed right through her. She wasn't a leaf on the wind, she was the wind. Something so insignificant that no one should ever even think to look for her. Was I mistaken? A low voice rumbled to itself. The shadow retreated. A large form approached Lyra once more. Lyra harumphed haughtily, though, perhaps in recognition of what was to come. She spun her hand, transforming her umbrella back into its bracelet state. Then, am I free to go, O Lord of the Forest? No. Whether it's merely your misfortune or intentional, you've grown too close. You're one of us now. The figure swooped Lyra up. She struggled, but to no avail. It couldn't be overthrown. Let me go. My father will. What father? Where's your colony, your partner? Water sprites never wander alone. Haven't you been expelled, you pitiful thing? What? Grow too interested in humans? Foolish child. Come along. This is better than being alone, isn't it? Lyra struggled harder, but the figure carried her off with ease. Behind the tree, Mouse remained hunkered for a long time, until the sun set again. Only then did she dare to jump up and run off, fleeing into the forest with silent footsteps. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. And please support the author by link in description. Rhys hovered in his core, contemplating the void. He thought he had a good enough comprehension of it to manipulate it, but that clearly wasn't the case, when it refused to so much as come when he called. He didn't understand it at all, or maybe, his understanding was so mistaken that he couldn't correctly call it. The void was a space that held garbage, and it had been thrown away by the Empire, at least, so it should qualify as garbage or garbage-related, in Rhys's opinion. Still, the fact that something was trash-related didn't equate to him instantly having genius-level comprehension in it, and while he didn't think he'd have to work twice as hard for half the result, he at least had to expend ordinary effort to understand it, or perhaps even something beyond ordinary effort, since the void seemed only tangentially related to trash, but still. It was close enough to qualify as trash, so he wasn't throwing his effort into an infinite hole, like he did when he tried to learn fireballs. This was a route worth pursuing, and he was confident that he could succeed, but it wouldn't be easy, or quick. Still, the end result was a can that could instantly warp trash to Rhys at any point, even during battle or when he desperately needed trash, so it was worth his effort. He focused on the void while recalling the words of the book at the same time. He still hadn't fully comprehended the book, or to be honest, made much progress on the book, but it seemed worthwhile to attempt understanding it while considering the void at the same time. Time passed. Rhys sat before his basket, immersed in his contemplation. The words from the book whirled before his eyes. He'd memorized them long ago, with how many times he'd read it. At the same time, the void stood before him. It wasn't much to look at, just an empty, hollow hole in space. It didn't whirl or swirl. If he didn't stare at it, it slipped out of his sight, vanishing into a wrinkle in space once more. If he stared at it too much, it closed in on him, threatening to overwhelm him. He had to look at it without looking at it, which was an exercise in of itself without also thinking about the book, but he insisted on keeping the book in his mind at the same time. There was something to that. Something kept shivering at the back of his mind when he recalled the book's words and gazed into the void. The two slowly overlapped, like when he crossed his eyes and started to see two images at once, but in reverse, the two comprehensions slowly merging back into one. What he'd thought was nonsense wasn't nonsense, not before the void. There was a truth to it, a strange echoing truth that only existed in his mind in those brief moments where he held both the book and the void in his perception at the same time. The nonsense began to make sense. The void began to unravel into truth. A kind of understanding came to him, vague and fuzzy though it was. The void was everywhere, and nowhere. It was everything and nothing. Connected and disconnected. It existed without and within, was a part of the world and completely apart from it. Defining it was impossible, because it was a thing that defied definition, yet it could be defined by its defiance. It was emptiness. It was a lack, not a thing. Trying to hold it wasn't like trying to hold sand, it was like trying to hold the absence of sand, like trying to cup your hand and insert it into a bucket of sand, letting the sand completely cover your palm, then pull your hand out without taking a single grain of sand with it. Like trying to put your hand in water without getting wet. Yeah, that's definitely the cleaner analogy of those two, Rhys thought, chuckling at himself. Either way, the problem remained the same. How did he take nothing and attach it to something? There wasn't anything to attach to anything else. Or rather, the basket was sitting there just fine, it was the void that was the problem. Knitting something to nothing was a tall order, and the more he considered it, the harder it seemed to become. If he wanted to knit water to the basket, that would have been difficult enough, but to knit the idea of a dry hand underwater to a basket. The absence of not just water would have been easy enough, he could have just waterproofed it, but everything, to knit that sensation into an object, he was starting to wonder if such a thing was even possible. It's magic. Magic can do anything, he told himself, but this particular kind of magic needed him to understand how to do the anything first, and since he didn't understand, he couldn't do it. Maybe that's what lessons and tomes do for other people, Rhys realized at last. There were no lessons and no tomes for trash magic. No one had bothered to put them together, for some reason, and his talent was so trash at non-trash magic that he couldn't utilize base tomes or lessons the way other people could. But if he wasn't trash talent at non-trash magic, then probably, tomes and lessons would explain the understanding part of magic to him, and he wouldn't have to comprehend it all on his own. Retreating from his mental space, he drew out the red tome and looked it over again. Was that what this was supposed to do? Read this tome and understand the void, thanks to what it said. He snorted, putting it back away. It felt like the tome had actively made his understanding worse, since he was struggling to figure out how it fit into what he understood the void to be, except that the void made so much more sense when he thought about the tome at the same time, so he couldn't abandon it. He sighed aloud. Probably the fact that the tome did an absolute trash job at explaining the void only made it better for him, not worse, but it didn't help him emotionally. It was still frustrating as hell. Rhys, are you? Oh, I'm so sorry. Rhys glanced over his shoulder. Corey stood there, looking aghast to have interrupted him in the middle of comprehending a topic. It was a rude thing to do, generally, but Rhys didn't care much about politeness among mages, and it wasn't like he'd announced he was going to wander off to study the void, so she wasn't in the wrong at all. Plus, if she'd come here looking for him, it was probably important. In fact, it was probably about the whole reason he was out here, focusing on the void rather than cooking, because he'd needed a distraction from worrying about Mouse and Lyra's quest. It was probably fine. There was no reason to be worried. Mouse was the stealthiest mage he'd ever met. But he knew nothing about their enemy's strength at their hideout, and he felt guilty for not going himself, so he couldn't help but worry. He knew his decision made sense. Someone had to protect their home base, so the Water Syndicate couldn't take it down while he was out scouting the Water Syndicate, and between scouting and protecting the home base was far more important. What he worried about was that the Water Syndicate had the same priorities, and their base was consequently full of Tier 3 mages while the weak Tier 2s got sent out to attack him. It was possible. Unlikely, especially in the Empire, but possible. After all, his tavern was only a small holding. If the Water Syndicate was small, then they were throwing their whole manpower against him to overturn his small holding, which would be a significant portion of their value. If they were big, on the other hand, and this was an insignificant holding which they were putting insignificant strength against. Rhys shook his head. They'd been sending their children. Surely that meant something. Logan definitely didn't mean anything. He had to stop catastrophizing before he actually heard what news Corey had come with. Maybe she'd just come to ask him where the next vat of oil was. As long as he sat here, thinking about 1,000 things and also nothing, he'd never find out. So instead, he smiled and stood. No, I was just getting frustrated and I needed a break. You're a welcome distraction. What is it? Corey stepped aside. At first, Rhys didn't understand why, but then he blinked, and Mouse was there. She'd always been there, he realized suddenly, he just hadn't been perceiving her. Oh, you're back. How'd it go? Relief flooded his system. Rhys looked around. Where's Lyra? Mouse's face crumpled, and Rhys's heart plunged. He stepped forward, feeling the need to do something, anything, though he didn't know what. No. Mouse held her hand up, choking back tears. She's alive, probably. She bluffed, and I think she took a deep breath. She's alive. Last I saw, she's alive. She got captured. What happened? Specifically. In detail, Rhys clarified. Mouse took a deep breath, then began. Rhys listened closely, frowning at parts, like where she described how strong the figure felt, or how suspicious they were of people poking around their edges. They were powerful and vigilant. Large. Small. He'd been considering the children the way he'd consider a mortal family's mortal children, but that wasn't right. These were mages. They'd been alive for hundreds of years, potentially. They could easily have dozens, and with a little work, hundreds of children. It was a horrifying concept to him, as someone who didn't like children and had never wanted to have them, but he was sure there were people to whom that proposition sounded amazing. Probably sex havers. Which wasn't the point. The point was, he'd thought he was killing 5 of maybe at most 10 children. He could have instead killed 5 of 500 children. That was a staggering difference in scale, and something he hadn't taken into account at all. He doubted that they had 500 children, but still. True, Logan had said he had 3 more brothers, which should mean 1 more after Larry and Leonard, but who knew? Maybe he had 3 brothers and 72 sisters. Maybe he was lying. Maybe he had 3 full-blooded siblings and 500 half-blooded siblings, or maybe he was thinking too small for the Water Syndicate, and the single pair of parents he'd been assuming this whole time for no damn reason. A little voice whispered in his ear it was actually 1 man and his giant harem, or a dozen pairs of adult siblings and their children, or a multi-generational family with lots of aunts and uncles and 1 grandparent set of patriarchs over all of them, such that Logan could truly only have 3 more siblings, and yet still belong to a huge, sprawling Water Syndicate. Now that I'm thinking, that kind of makes the most sense, if it's a huge family divided into areas/segments. Then the Water Syndicate could be small enough to invest significant effort against Rhys's Little Snack Shack, the local crime family, headed by the L brothers' parents, yet large enough to involve a large overall territory and powerful mages who had no right being bothered by a small-scale takeover of a single tavern. What had those thugs said? The Waters family lead the most powerful crime syndicate in this area. The most powerful. If it was just 1 family and their semi-competent Tier 2 siblings, then that made no sense at all. If it was many branches of 1 large multi-generational family, and this was merely 1 semi-competent branch of it, then that painted a very different picture. Rhys licked his lips, trepidatious, and yet also excited. He'd bitten off a lot. Was it more than he could chew? Or had he simply taken on the fastest way to accelerate his plan to rot the Empire from within with trash? If this went well, then he would have made incredible advancements in his ultimate plan. His excitement was tempered by Lyra's situation. He narrowed his eyes. First, he had to get Lyra back. Then, the rest of the Water Syndicate. If he couldn't take them over, then maybe he could negotiate. And who knew? He wasn't going to rest on his laurels. He intended to continue growing stronger and stronger, until he could overcome everything. Why not use this syndicate to initiate his ability to grow stronger? I'd like my core back before I make a significant advancement. Rhys's thoughts trailed off. He looked down at the trash star within him. Was that his root? Did he need a core at all? If he had formed his own version of a core, according to his path, was that not superior to the trash tier core he'd been born with? The system didn't seem to mind. As long as he had a core and some magic, it didn't protest the source of it. In fact, getting hung up on the core at all was all on his part, and nothing from the system side. Hadn't Lyra said, too, that her internal construction was so different that the Empress couldn't remove her core? Maybe it was very human of him to care at all. And if the Empress could remove cores but not non-cores, wasn't his trash star a distinct advantage? None of that mattered. Not right now. Rhys dusted off his shoulders. I'm headed to the base. Mouse, you and Sable guard the tavern. I'm going to get Lyra back. Rhys didn't hesitate. He'd already made up his mind, so he had to move immediately. After all, there were 2 options. He waited until they forgot about Lyra, then attacked, or he attacked immediately, before they had a chance to move Lyra around or seriously injure her. From Mouse's telling of the situation, he chose to act immediately. If they'd known for sure that Lyra was sent here, or that she had backing, then it made more sense to wait, and act as if she was low value, but they didn't. They hadn't seen Mouse, and Lyra had claimed she was alone. They might have doubts about Lyra's claim, but that was different than 100% expecting someone to come after her. If he acted now, they would still be caught up in doubting, and wouldn't have decided one way or another, whereas if he waited, they would decide their doubt one way or another. They might decide it in Lyra's favor, but they might not. Now, before they decided either way, he would strike, wipe out what he could of the Water Syndicate, absorb the rest, and rescue Lyra. No, wait, I've got that backwards. Rescue Lyra, then the rest of that. A little shine of fear lived in the depths of his heart. Someone more dangerous than him. Someone far more dangerous. Not strong enough to notice Mouse, but what did that mean? The Empire had overlooked Mouse. The rest of him pushed back against that fear. He had impurities, poison, and trash by the buckets. What could this mystery figure do against that? Even the Empress feared impurities. If this mage started stronger than him, he could simply impurify them down to his level. Long live debuffs. Long live poison. Unless the powerful mage one-shot him from across the world. Unless he got headshot from the other side of the map. Unless. Rhys took a deep breath. All his hellish FPS memories had nothing to do with this situation. The chances the mage could, or would, execute him from miles out without him being able to even react were low. He wasn't going to get spawn camped. He wasn't going to get hammered every time he poked his head out of cover. He wasn't going to get wallbanged. Safe, safe, safe. He'd be, not safe, but not OHKO'd without even knowing which direction the bullet had come from. This wasn't an FPS world anyways, thank goodness. Well, I'd already be dead if it was. He'd had no talent at FPSs and no twitch reflexes to speak of. But in this world, he could sense things with his aura. He wouldn't get surprised. Even if the mage was way stronger than him, he would be able to react and at least run away, if not respond. Why am I so scared? He'd fought before. He'd even fought way stronger mages before. So why? But no, he knew it. It was because of Lyra. Because Lyra had been captured. Until now, he'd been winning. He hadn't lost anyone. None of his foes had demonstrated the ability to easily capture the warriors under him, with such strength and acuity that his men and women weren't even able to fight back. From Mouse's telling, the guy had just scooped up Lyra. Forget fighting back. Forget resisting. Just swooped her up and taken her home. It spooked him more than he'd expected it to. Sure, the Empire had taken his friend's awa, from a certain way of looking at things, but that was one thing. The Empire was the Empire. Above board. So incredibly more powerful than him that it didn't bear thinking about. This was the Water Syndicate. A secret, hidden force that he knew near nothing about, except that one of its members was capable of capturing Lyra single-handedly and suppressing her to the extent that all she could do was flail like a little kid being kidnapped by an adult. Rhys took a deep breath. Stop panicking. I don't panic. I've been decored by the EMPR, by a little white tampon asshat with what felt like a rusty spoon. I spent 3 years in the mines. I don't panic. The image of Laurent as a tampon with a face and little stick arms and legs actually did improve his mood, and Rhys moved on, steadier than before. Not steadily, because trash step didn't work like that, and the ground was a mix of knotty tree roots, trash footing, and soft, rich earth, not trash but steadier. His eyes narrowed, and his thoughts narrowed to a laser focus. Lyra. He'd go there, announce nothing, hit the syndicate so hard they'd feel it for months, rescue Lyra, and then, if everything went well, behead their regional leader and install himself in their place. I didn't realize how much my people mean to me. That was what this was, start to finish. He was intimidated by whoever had attacked Lyra. The prospect of taking on the Water Syndicate alone with no backup made his heart race, but he was marching on anyways. The part that really scared him, the part that actually made him hurt when he poked at it, was the thought of Lyra, captured, in danger, threatened unfairly by a dangerous force, all because he'd overestimated her and underestimated the Syndicate. She was one of his, not anyone else's, and she'd undertaken the mission on his orders, because he'd thought she could handle it. She hadn't been able to, and that was his fault, and his responsibility to rectify it and save her. Some dim part of him was a little proud that he wasn't hesitating. Another part was terrified of the same. His people were a serious lever. If an enemy realized it, they could seriously harm him. That part of him wanted to stop and think about the long-term implications of rushing to save Lyra, of what it might indicate to those who wanted to harm him later. The unhesitating part smacked that part of him in the face. So what? Was he supposed to become a coward and a loner because of that? What a trash conclusion, something to store away for later, but honestly, it was something that had always annoyed him. I have to be alone for your sake. Ah, Serious eye roll. He was tired of that line. Never worked out in any of his trashy comics either, so he'd never understood those loner arcs. Since the weak people around the hero would always be captured regardless of whether they were around the hero or not, why push them away? No. Hold them close, utilize their unique skills, grow stronger from their strengths, and if they got caught. Then he'd just have to be strong enough to steal them back. He'd been slacking lately. He'd been so focused on taking down the Empire from the inside that he'd neglected his own personal growth. But he couldn't neglect that. He'd known it, and knew it still. This plan of his wouldn't work as a low-rank Tier 3. Eventually, the Empire would realize his tier, and place warriors at all the camps who could oppose him. If they hadn't already, they only didn't already have Tier 3 or 4 warriors there because they needed little to suppress the workers, and no one was going to enter the Empire to free them. The longer he fought, though, the more likely they were to beef up their guards, and Rhys had to be ready when it happened. He closed his eyes, trusting himself to trash step for a few beats. He wouldn't neglect it any longer. He'd get stronger. First, by mastering the void and distributing trash cans all over the Empire that could suck up all their trash, and possibly even act as a teleportation network for him, if everything went right. After that, well, if the trash cans really worked the way he hoped they would, they'd be an ideal way for his to discover new impure wells. He'd suck up all the Empire's wells, and then, he didn't know. Look for pieces of straw. That could happen in coordination with the wells. Find new curses. If nothing else, the writer's skeleton would get more filled out. Hopefully some horse would show up in the mix at some point. Reforge the Sun Sword. He was tempted, but was still afraid he lacked the skill. He hadn't tried swordsmithing at all, and the Sun Sword, he got one shot at it. If it went wrong, that was it. No more Sun Sword. Maybe I should look for a talented swordsmith, rather than DIYing it. It was a very untrashy thought of him. Treating a priceless artifact to a DIY makeover was the ultimate trashy thing to do. Why? He could think of a fantastic image of Jesus Christ that had been absolutely DI'd into something, unrecognizable was the best word, back in his homeworld. Sure, he couldn't hope to restore the Sun Sword to its pristine glory that way, and he might in fact destroy it past salvage, but for him, wasn't that the same as improving it? Rhys chuckled under his breath. I'll keep it in mind. He still wasn't sure he wanted to touch the Sun Sword at all. The immense power in it far exceeded what he'd felt from a quarry, and she was a schoolmaster. To this day, he could still treat it as an ultimate weapon. A last-ditch attack with his all behind it, that, if his gauges of power were at all accurate, would inflict a serious blow to the Empress herself. Not a killing blow, no, but a serious blow. He touched his storage ring. He'd brought it, and his corrosive potion. Just in case. Ideally, neither would come into play, but he wanted all options on the table. He'd use the potion first, but if it came down to it, he'd use the Sun Sword to free Lyra. He wasn't leaving here without her. Seriously, that second, hesitant voice whispered, your people are a dangerous lever. And the Water Syndicate was about to find out how dangerous. Mouse had given him a map and a very detailed rundown on how to reach the Water Syndicate, and it wasn't hard for him to locate it with her map and description. He wasn't directionally gifted himself, but he wasn't challenged either, so he only got lost once or twice before he encountered one of her landmarks and knew to adjust his path. Her notes included a bunch of circles around the particular ravine and an extra set of red lines around the upper edges of the ravine along with the words extreme danger. Which would have been funny if Lyra's life wasn't on the line. As it was, he took her words to heart and did exactly what the Water Syndicate wanted him to do. Without hesitation, he marched directly into the ravine's mouth, throwing himself to the belly of the stone beast. This was not going to be subtle or stealthy. He was charging in, and he was doing it head-on. They were getting the full frontal, whether they wanted it or not. I should have worn a trench coat, he noted amusedly, not that this world had something like that. The secondary implications of that thought hit him like a train, and he laughed again, more darkly. Oh, yeah, this was definitely trench coat territory. Since he was in his villain era, he had decided to dress the part. He'd borrowed some black robes and red face paint, smearing the latter across his forehead and letting it drip all the way down his face and dry in globs. It ran down his face in rivulets, collecting in his eyelids, then dripping down again, as though he was crying blood. His fingers had been dyed crimson by the effort, and he left them that way. A wide-brimmed, dark hat with hanging veils finished the look. It obscured the face paint for now, but sometimes, the most important part of a costume was the moment of reveal. Being able to easily remove some small component to show someone a surprise, even in a passing moment where someone called his character's name in a hallway, was something he'd done a few times to great effect back in his cosplay days, and when he was going for dramatic effect, there was nothing wrong with leaning on those days a little more than usual. It wasn't as though he thought the surprise would make anyone pause in battle, though he wouldn't mind if they did, but rather, his character motive today was the battle-frenzied madman. It wasn't his actual motive, but since he'd realized he had dangerous levers, he'd also realized he needed to hide them. If he came here as Lyra's vengeful boss and failed, lost, or otherwise had to retreat before he found Lyra, Lyra would be in danger, and far more danger than she'd been when he'd started, at that. No, especially if the Water Syndicate was larger than he'd thought, he wanted to rescue her while giving the minimal information about himself away. Therefore, he was a battle-crazed madman who'd come here to test his skills. His sword skills were enough, from his days with Bast and Straw, to manage to appear that way against the low-level members of their group, and if he started pulling out esoteric skills later, then the Water Syndicate would simply assume he'd gotten serious and been forced to actually fight with all he had, including his dirty tricks, when in reality Rhys was nothing but a box of dirty tricks. He was using this world's philosophy of, hold some skills back to disguise your true strength until you're pushed to your limits against it, and he wasn't afraid to admit it. Besides, it really made more sense than a lot of armchair fighters thought it did. Sure, in a world with guns, why worry about concealing skills, when one bullet ended the conversation regardless? But in a world with magic, if he one-shot every low-tier mage with his highest power skill, not only did he waste mana and trash, but he also revealed his strongest attack right out the gate. Other mages could watch him fight and learn how to counter his strongest move. When he fought those mages, who were at his power level, later, their ability to counter his strongest move, his ace, without revealing or using their own ace, would leave him at a significant disadvantage, and could even be the difference between life and death. Now, a slow battle of escalation was ridiculous. 2. There was no reason for every battle between Tier 3 mages to start with Tier 1 swordplay and a slow escalation through the ranks of Tier 2 before finally hitting Tier 3. Although Rhys did enjoy reading those battles, he had to admit, yeah, real battles didn't work like that. Unless there was an extreme need to conserve mana, they'd simply start by striking one another with their Tier 3 moves and escalate from there. And even in a situation where they needed to conserve mana, it might earnestly be cheaper in mana to start from Tier 3 skills. But still, spells weren't bullets, and magic wasn't a gun. There was a reason aces were left in the hole, rather than being fired off right off the bat. Of course, if he saw an opportunity to decapitate the head of the Water Syndicate with a quickshot from his ace skill, would he hold back? Probably not, but it really would depend on the situation. If there were a dozen other powerful mages around who he'd have to fight afterwards, it would depend on whether he could defeat all of them without his ace, too, since they'd have seen it and have a chance to counter it. Not that Rhys was going to complain too loudly. If most people thought it was a trashy way to fight, then who was he to argue it wasn't? He wasn't 100% sure how his trash path interacted with abstract concepts like that, but if he could eke a boost out of it, he wouldn't complain. Of course, he was talking about a complex, abstract concept that had mostly been perceived as trash back on his homeworld, while it was generally accepted as a fact of life here, so who knew if he could boost it with his path or not? Future considerations. For now, he'd rescue Lyra, crush the Water Syndicate, then subsume it, then go ponder the void until he could make his trash cans. Rhys almost laughed, then let himself laugh aloud. What a ridiculously easy set of goals he had before him. Certainly, he could complete them with no problem, right? Hello there, young man. You seem a jolly fellow. I wonder what a jolly fellow such as yourself is doing in this neck of the woods. Rhys looked up, keeping his head slightly bent so the veils hid his face paint completely, while angling his chin so the gap in the veils aligned with one of his eyes. His lone visible eye locked onto the other man's, and the two of them gazed at each other for a beat. He'd known the man was following him for some time now, though he'd pretended to be ignorant. This man, whoever he was, hadn't felt particularly powerful to Rhys, so he wasn't surprised that he wasn't facing the terrifying giant Mouse had described, but rather a wiry figure in green robes with a snake swirling over them. The wiry man perched in a nearby tree, leaning against its trunk lazily, one leg dangling down, the other propped on the branch. From his pose, Rhys would have thought he'd been sitting there all along if he hadn't been tracking the man's mana signature for the last half hour. It turned out that hanging around Mouse was a great way to train his passive detection abilities. It wasn't as though he'd been actively trying to sense Mouse all the time, but he did sometimes try to find or sense her, and even when he didn't actively seek her out, the same part of his mana sense that passively kept track of everyone and everything magical around him had been passively tracking Mouse, to the extent it could. On top of that, he'd had every single mage under his leadership learn a mana signature suppressing or disguising skill. There wasn't a single person around him that wasn't suppressing their aura to some extent or another at all times, and yet, Rhys had been casually using his mana signature to detect them this whole time, subconsciously straining a little harder than usual without realizing it. As a result, even though he hadn't noticed, his mana senses had become extraordinarily sensitive to low-grade, disguised, and hidden signatures, and the man in the tree now was no great talent, so he'd stood out to Rhys like a beacon. It was honestly a little embarrassing how easily he'd picked the guy out. If he told the man, he imagined Mr. Snake Robes would be mortified. Still, he wasn't here to brag about his mana senses, so Rhys arched a single brow, as if he was trying to suppress a reaction, when really it was the opposite, he was trying to express a reaction. The effect of arching one brow was diminished by the veiled hat, but that was the price he had to pay for fashion. At last, it registered that the man had asked him a question and expected an answer. Rhys knew why he was here, and he knew what he was going to do, but to the man and the rest of the Water Syndicate, he was just someone wandering in the woods in gloomy robes. He was so laser-focused that he'd forgotten that from outside, there was nothing at all to indicate anything special about him. He cleared his throat. I'm merely a jolly fellow wandering through the woods. Is there a problem with that? Knowing what they'd done to Lyra, he knew the answer, but why not play along? Snake Robes clicked his tongue. Really? A stray merchant, lost from his caravan? Or are you a student from one of those military academies, full of righteousness, who just happened to get lost down this ravine by total happenstance? Rhys raised his brows. A certain tampon-looking white-haired student with far too much righteousness for someone who scooped the cores out of people with all the dexterity of a drunken monkey came to mind, and he gave Snake Robes a look. What if I was? Snake Robes snorted. Then I would advise you to find another route. You aren't ready for this one yet, child. The Empire doesn't care as much about your bones as you think it does. You'll rot here with all the rest, and there will not be a military force that comes down upon our heads to eradicate us. The Empress has her hands full with the war. That sword saint of theirs was more powerful than she expected, apparently. Oh. Rhys quickly repressed the excitement that welled up at hearing that the sword saint was still alive. It wasn't as if he doubted it. If the sword saint died, he was pretty sure the rest of their region would go belly up pretty quick, and there'd be no war, no more work camps, no more fighting. The Empress wouldn't be distracted by the fighting, and she'd focus on consolidating the territory she'd taken instead. Rhys would suddenly find his little chips and fries operation far more scrutinized than it was during wartime, and his dreams of taking down the Empire from the inside would grow far more distant, without the external pressure of a war to cause damage from the outside at the same time that he damaged the inside. Why am I pretending? I'm just glad that Bast is still alive. If the Sword Saint was alive, then his apprentice was almost certainly alive as well. If the Sword Saint was dead, then Bast was definitely dead as well. It wasn't as if the Sword Saint being alive guaranteed his friend was, too, but the odds went up. Way up. Way up. It was very like him to get analytic when faced with something so emotional. His and Bast's relationship was weird, to say the least, and he hadn't been lying when he'd explained it to Az, but to say it wasn't as genuine as it was calculated was. No, or rather, the calculation is how I explained it being genuine. The end result was, he didn't want Bast to die. And he really would do everything in his power to keep it that way. Why are you smiling? Snake Robes asked. Rhys touched the edge of his hat. You really wouldn't believe me. Try me. Instead, Rhys drew his sword. An unbroken one. The broken one stayed close at hand, hidden in his robes, but that was for later. For now, he was going to commit to the bit. A wandering swordsman who'd stumbled upon the ravine and decided to dispense a little justice. And since Snake Robes had so kindly reminded him that wandering swordsman wasn't really a thing that happened in the Empire, it was time for a little improv on his backstory. He wasn't just a wandering swordsman, but a dissatisfied military student who was here to impose his righteousness on this ravine by dressing up as a wandering swordsman. To himself, Rhys thought, who would have expected all my time role-playing and playing D&D would come in handy. As a chronic lazy asshole who couldn't be asked to make a character ahead of time, he was the #1 most skilled at adapting his backstory on the fly, a truly trashy skill set that had most DMs suspicious of him not putting in the effort, if they didn't figure it out and become outright enraged instead. So today, he was Evil Laurent, and Evil Laurent was here to impose lawful good upon all the evildoers, and probably suck their cores out, too, while he was at it. In the name of the law, of course. And righteousness, or whatever. I promise I'll do it more gently than the real Laurent. Not that anyone here will survive the experience. Snake Robes raised his brows. He unwound from the tree and dropped soundlessly to the ground, almost like a snake uncoiling from a branch. You'll regret this, kid. He waggled the sword in a really vague approximation of the way Laurent had opened his volley in their duel and grinned, knowing Snake Robes couldn't see it past all the veils. On guard, Snake Robes reached into one of his sleeves and withdrew a long, coiled whip. He released it, and the coils smacked the ground one after another with more weight and heft than a whip that size should have. Rhys faced him in an approximation of the Empire's stiff sword form, based on foggy 3-year-old memories of the one time he and Laurent had fought. Hopefully Laurent's form was standard, because if he'd made any variations, then Rhys would be making them too. Not that Laurent struck him as the type to do anything but standard form. He probably worshipped standard form, to be honest. The guy was a little too upright and uptight for his own good. It was something Laurent would have to grow past, though the Empress wasn't likely to let him. Not that I care what happens to my enemies. This whip is the 1000 poison steel whip. It's made of 1000 strands of steel wire, and each strand has been imbued with a unique poison. You will die screaming in pain, covered in boils, burning and freezing at the same time, and that's only a few of the milder poisons, Snake Robes told Rhys. Really? Rhys asked, his attention suddenly piqued. The whip was doused in new and interesting impurities and filth. Had Snake Robes made it just for him? Truly. If you still wish to flee. Huh. Rhys blinked, then realized, Snake Robes was still trying to bluff him off. The guy really thought he was a dumb kid with a death wish. Which, from a certain perspective, he was, but from another perspective, he definitely wasn't. For one, this 1000 poisons death rope posed no danger to him, except in that he might spend too much time studying it after he stole it from Snake Robes' cold, dead hands. For another, he wasn't actually one of the Empire's military school students on a righteousness kick. He had far more tools up his sleeves than any of them. A thought suddenly whispered at the back of his mind, this might actually be too easy. If these guys were used to fighting rejects from the Empress school, who were all taught to fight in the same stiff way that only made sense in formations, then he was about to blow through this camp like a hurricane. The only people he'd really have to look out for were those with enough raw power to ignore his cheap tricks. It did make sense. It wasn't like the Empire's nobility was going to up and quit military school one day to decide to take on some low-level criminals in the woods that the nobility was probably busy deliberately overlooking for some internal politics reason or another. It'd only be the kids like Laurent. The common, low-ranked kids with no social standing and therefore no unique magics or skills, who split from the herd and decided they had had enough with the criminals, to the point they'd actually try to take them on. Only the low-ranking kids, who actually fell hook, line, and sinker for the Empire's righteousness brainwashing, like Laurent, rather than the noble kids who could look around them as they grew up and see the Empire's righteousness for what it was: corrupt, full of holes, poorly patched up by the nobles, whose existence didn't fit in the Empress's world order at all, except that they were too powerful for her to eject, kill, or ignore. It was strange that it was the privileged who were more likely to see the inequality of this world, but then, when Rhys thought about it, that would have been standard even in his world until more recently, wouldn't it have been? It wasn't as if serfs, eking a living out of their lord's dry earth, had the time to think about whether it was fair or not that the king took 10% of their food for the winter. They had no rights in the matter. All they could do was keep their heads down and survive. Knowledge was for the lofty thinkers. In his world, historically, the lords and nobles. In this world, mages. And in the Empire, which was tilted by the Empress such that the mages were no longer given universal access to knowledge, knowledge was once more locked in the hands of nobility. Snake Robes snapped his whip, dragging Rhys back to reality. "If you won't back down, then have it you," Rhys replied, loudly but not quite shouting, and charged Snake Robes. It wouldn't do if the whole camp came out this early, after all. He was confident in his ability to take down the low-rank fighters, but he didn't want to be mobbed, either. He was currently burning his trash fire at about a Tier 2 level, which was why Snake Robes, a fellow Tier 2, hadn't gone to fetch any backup. It did mean, unlike other suppression techniques, that Rhys was, actually, a Tier 2 right now, but with the option to instantly become a Tier 3 at any moment he needed. He didn't anticipate needing to against Snake Robes' delicious whip of strange and tasty new poisons, but it was an option. The whip snaked forth. Snake Robes had a bored look on his face, and the whip, commensurate with that expression, twisted in the air to strike exactly where Rhys's next step would have been, if he'd been better at copying Laurent's technique. Instead, Trash Step sped his feet and lengthened his step a little, and the whip struck under his foot as his foot came down. "Wow. Didn't even know I could use weapons is trash, for Trash Step," Rhys thought, as he propelled himself at Snake Robes. It wasn't just the usual passive level of boosting his footing on bad footing. Instead, maybe because of the strong aura of filth and impurities radiating from the whip, his step had drifted toward the whip, and the whip had drifted toward the ground. As though he wasn't just coincidentally boosted by stepping on trash, but instead, the trash appeared under his foot to support him. In his mind's eye, he saw protagonists supported on lotus flowers as they stepped down from the heavens. Was it like that, but trash? Would he spawn crumpled chip bags behind him as he walked? It was kind of disgusting, but since he could also absorb the chip bags afterward. While I wasn't looking, my abilities got stronger. Is this because I haven't really tested them out since I hit Tier 3? Rhys made a mental note to test all his skills, one he knew he'd immediately forget and ignore, and looked down at his foot. He still had Snake Robes' whip pinned. Both he and Snake Robes looked a little nonplussed by the whole event, both of them startled into simply freezing and staring at his foot. At last, he cleared his throat. "If you're going to look at my feet that hard, I'm going to have to charge." Snake Robes snarled and yanked his whip hard enough that the knitted steel wires ate into the sole of Rhys's shoe. Rhys felt the poisons enter his bloodstream, and hopped back to take a moment to investigate them. They were disappointing, honestly. The impure wells were far more virulent and dangerous, and his various resist skills were more than capable of handling this level of poison. Even without him consciously thinking about it, his body and mana system quickly redirected the poisons to his core, where they were unceremoniously deposited on the trash star. Rhys sighed in disappointment. So much for studying the whip. He might as well just absorb the poisons now for the power boost. His trash star was getting a little low, after all. Snake Robes narrowed his eyes. Now that you've had a taste. Rhys waved his fingers. A multitude of colorful liquids lifted off the whip, whirled around in midair, and swirled into him. Snake Robes' eyes bulged. He looked at Rhys in shock. Rhys sighed again, then met Snake Robes' eyes. Realization flashed through Rhys's. Oh, huh. I guess I could have poisoned you with that, but surely you were immune to the poisons. I mean, you kept that thing in your robes. Surely, Snake Robes said, in a tone that told Rhys he was definitely not immune to the poisons. Well, on guard. Rhys tried again, lifting his sword once more. Snake Robes threw aside his no longer poisoned whip and fled for the hills. Rhys watched him go, a little mystified. He hadn't even gotten the chance to announce himself and whip his hat off to reveal the dramatic face paint. He was planning to do that halfway through the battle at a moment of maximum tension, but instead, I guess I keep wearing the hat for now. He shrugged, picked up the whip, and walked on. Snake Robes had outright fled, vanishing into the forest, so Rhys walked on without any particular hurry to his motions. Snake Robes was smart enough to figure out what Rhys was here to do and know he wanted no part in it. He expected the guy would be back in a few hours, after everything blew over, probably with some convenient excuse or another, but given that he didn't start screaming or run directly into camp, he didn't think there was a need to chase him down right now. Eventually, sure, the farm needed able bodies. But right now, he had worse prey to hunt. Rhys stalked forward, keeping up his persona as the edgy student who'd finally snapped with a few glares, a rigid back, and nicely spaced steps, moving like the kids he saw coming to get chips between classes. He adjusted his grip a few times, trying to perfectly emulate Laurent, though his memories of that encounter were a bit fuzzy by now. It was probably fine. No way had these criminals memorized the exact sword grip the Empire favored. Then again, where did the Water Syndicate come from, if not military school dropouts? It wasn't like there was a great number of mages running around at random in the Empire. The Water Syndicate was either a fallen noble family, which he highly doubted, but who knew? He hadn't met the Patriarchs, a bunch of military dropouts, or foreign mages, or some mix of all three. The most likely to him was a mix of the last two, with the main family pegged as military dropouts, and the recruits like Snake Robes and his big poison string as foreign mages who'd overstayed their welcome. There were no more guards before he came to the outskirts of the camp. Why would there be? That was Snake Robes' job, and presumably, he did it well enough when someone didn't come along and slurp the poison off his poison whip like they were sucking sour dust off a sour straw. At its very edges, the camp looked about how he'd expected it to. A few tents were built into lean-tos, something a little bit temporary and reconstructible about all the structures out here. Fire pits smoked gently in the midday sun, waiting to be stoked for some purpose or another, and from the medicinal smell in the air, they likely had a pill cooker or potion brewer out here. It made enough sense. Magic consumables were volatile, so it didn't make sense to brew them in the heart of anything, let alone criminal camp. He didn't know if the magic consumables they were brewing were legal or recreational, but whichever they were, they'd be brewing soda soon enough. He stalked by, waiting for someone to challenge him. The mages in this part of camp were scrawny, with calloused hands, arms, and faces from stirring the aforementioned volatile potions, and while they gave him strange looks, no one bothered to intercept him. He deliberately walked a little closer to one of the potion brewers than absolutely necessary, and the woman stepped away from him. Go bother the fighters. I'm just trying to study adhesives. Rhys raised his brows. He hadn't really thought about that, but the Empire suppressed everything, didn't it? These potion brewers probably didn't want to make drugs, but what else could they do? If their research didn't align with the Empire's goals, did they have another option but to become criminals to pursue it? Interesting. So he wasn't just obtaining a logistics network, he was also obtaining an entire research department, too. The more he thought about it, the better taking over the water syndicate sounded to him. Sure, they might not be too excited about their new assignment as soda and chip flavor investigators, but from what he knew of the sciencey types, they'd happily go along with it as long as he also gave them time to work on their heart's desires. He didn't have any quarrel with the scientists/drug makers, so he walked on. There was a narrow segment full of trees between the potion-making section of the camp and the next, and Rhys headed for that. He was barely a few steps into the forest before a voice called out. "Stop! Stop!" Rhys stopped obediently, always a rule follower when it was convenient for him, anyways. A figure approached him from dead on, a slender woman who narrowed her eyes at him. "Who are you? Where did you come from?" He thought for a moment. This was a unique opportunity. He was already in the camp, and there wasn't as obvious a need to question him. Snake Robes had run off. Maybe he could bluff. It wouldn't make sense with his backstory, but, whatever, he decided. It was convenient in the moment. He'd let the woman come up with the explanation of why a righteous schoolboy would do it later. "I'm here to join the syndicate," he said. Her eyes narrowed. "Are you?" "Nope, that's a failure." Without another word, Rhys drew his sword and rushed her. She had seen through his obvious lie, so it was no surprise that his surprise attack was handily blocked. She had the attitude and the strength of a sword's master, though she fought with the stiffness of the Empire's sword style. Definitely a military dropout. They only traded blows for a split second when she pressed the attack, fighting harder than before. Rhys had to flare his trash star to the limits of Tier 2 to keep up, and in so doing, was forced to drop the little he understood about the Empire's sword style. Instead, he fought with the inelegant, savage style he'd learned from Bast and Straw, treating the sword more like an object than the delicate, precisely balanced tool it was. He couldn't use sword intent, and this sword wasn't trashed, so when her eyes shone and the edge of her sword blazed like a cold star, Rhys angled his sword so she'd cut through its blade without harming him. "You aren't a student. Who are you?" she challenged him. "I am a student." Full of pent-up sexual confusion and righteousness. Rhys declared. She squinted at him. "What? And I'm going to defeat you." He tightened his grip on the broken sword and activated trash intent on the beleaguered thing. The woman's eyes widened as the blade reappeared, almost slicing through her stomach. She jumped back at the last second, or else he would have spilled her guts without even trying. "That's not something they teach you in the Empire's sword school," she accused him. "It totally is. You must have played hooky that day." "Played hooky?" The woman gave him a look like she didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "At the Empire's school. I guess it's not the kind of place that kind of thing happens, huh?" Dug in too deep to back out, Rhys nodded firmly. "Yep. And now I'm going to defeat you with my totally Empire-based sword skills." She sighed and lifted her sword again. "This is not how I imagined dying. You don't have to die. I'm here for a hostile takeover, but not a total elimination of the syndicate. By the way, where are the rest of the Waters brothers?" "You, alone. A hostile takeover?" she asked, laughing. "Yep." Her expression sobered. She lifted her sword again. "Whether you're a student of the Empire or not, we end this between us." "You seemed pretty cool. I didn't really want to kill you," Rhys returned, hoisting his to match. He didn't use the Empire's sword stance this time, but his own. She charged, killing intent burning in her eyes. Rhys took a deep breath. He really didn't want to kill her. She was the exact kind of dedicated underling he needed under him. So, for a split second, he burned the trash star hotter. A split second was all he needed. He leapt off the ground and dashed behind her, hammering the butt of the sword into the back of her head. A moment later, it was over, but it was a moment too long. Even before he reined his strength back in, he could sense multiple higher-tier mana signatures closing in on him. He could stand there and fight, but that wouldn't help him find Lyra. No, he had a better idea. He raced off into the forest, picking a direction none of the strong signatures were rushing toward him from. After all, if all the strong signatures were rushing here, couldn't he freely run around the rest of the area while they all looked for him in this forest? I wonder if people in this world have ever heard of Whack-A-Mole. Rhys dashed through the forest, simultaneously highly pleased with his new plan and mildly disappointed that his face paint was going to start dripping down his face again due to all the sweat long before anyone got to admire it. There weren't any setting sprays in this world, which was a disappointment and a vast oversight. How was his cool makeup supposed to keep looking cool without a setting spray? Plus, what if someone wanted to hug? Sure, it was far less likely here than it had been at cons, but still. He was trying to be considerate. No one wanted paint all over their clothes. It occurred to him that he would probably be wildly popular with this world's women if he developed a setting spray, and he put that little morsel in the remember later inbox in his head. Speaking of, if the chips thing didn't work, he could always fall back to makeup producer. He wasn't quite as familiar with makeup as he was with food, but he dabbled in his cosplay days. Even in his world, makeup was full of wildly toxic substances like asbestos, so surely in this world no one would bat an eye if his makeup had a little more impurities than average. Of course, it wasn't as good an impurity delivery method as food, and it mostly targeted women, which struck him as a little unfair, but hey, all was fair in love and war. War crimes. What were those? He managed to clear the forest area before anyone zeroed in on his location and came out to a much more stable and fully built-out region of the camp. Here, there were buildings. Not nice ones, but buildings. They had good foundations, but the ramshackle, musty, molded edges and slightly askew beams of buildings that were in use, but not well maintained. Buildings that were very active, but not very clean. People mostly relaxed in the yards or stood within the buildings, doing things. The few who were outside gave Rhys a weird look, but no one immediately challenged him. It was outright shocking how few of them were attacking. Then again, Rhys realized, the Empire is a peaceful place. He wasn't wearing a shining white uniform and screeching about righteousness, so he must be a new recruit. In other words, if he wasn't obviously on the Empire's team, he was probably on theirs. It wasn't like his home region, where anyone would be regarded with suspicion for wandering somewhere they weren't supposed to go. There were two teams, the Empire, and not the Empire. He wasn't the Empire, therefore, he was probably on their team. If they'd sensed the Tier 3 emanation from the forest, they'd assumed it was being handled, or at least didn't want to get involved. He'd really been hoping Lyra would be held in a giant cage or, I dunno, a hot tub with bars on, but there was nothing obvious. No sign pointing to the corner with, prisoners over here, on it, either. He reached out to the limits of his mana senses, but Tier 2 Rhys couldn't sense anything. Either she was behind some kind of barrier, or too far away, or... Don't think about that last one. He didn't want to push that lever any further down. He wasn't sure what would happen, but he knew that he'd immediately forget his dream logistics network and research lab in favor of something more drastic. What, exactly, was up in the air, and something he didn't want to look directly at. But drastic, for certain. Mouse had said they'd captured Lyra. Mouse had said they didn't know. He had to believe in that. There was no reason to execute random water sprites in the woods. Between humans and water sprites, one of them lived in the woods full-time as a usual part of their life cycle, and the other one wandered off into the woods to start criminal syndicates. If they executed every being that wandered through the woods and looked vaguely humanoid, they'd have their hands full with a lot of work for no real reason. She had to be somewhere. But where? I don't have much time, but I do have time. At this point, Rhys was in deep enough that people assumed he should be here. Not having a Tier 3 emanation helped, too. The black robes and the veiled hat were attention-grabbing, but not crazy attention-grabbing among a group that included snake robes. There was a guy, or maybe girl, wrapped so thickly in bandages from head to toe that he couldn't tell their gender, for example, and a man in a white opera mask and matching gloves, but otherwise normal mages, robes. He moved with purpose, but not too much purpose. Nothing to draw too much attention, or too little. He paused a few times to pretend like he was doing something so it wasn't too obvious that he was looking around. He didn't want to look lost, after all. There was an unconscious woman in the woods, and the door guard had run off. Something was going on. He couldn't pull the, "Please help the newbie," without casting suspicions on himself. His time was running out. He could already feel it. If he couldn't find Lyra soon, he was going to have to go with Plan B, defeat the Water Syndicate, then find Lyra. He really wanted to know where she was first, if possible, though. Not actually free her, since the second he acted toward her, she would immediately become a target. Right now he was just an unattached crazy guy, and there was no reason for anyone to attack her. But it was better to know where she was and if she was in a bad situation where he did need to immediately intervene, versus if he could let her stay captured for a little longer, keep eyes off her, and let her stay in relative safety, untargeted by the criminals. Knowledge was power, and he just didn't know anything right now. His diminished Tier 2 senses could feel the powerful mages closing in on him. They were getting close. This area wasn't big enough for a true round of whack-a-mole, and once they'd sensed his mana, they could sense that it was still him. Even with the weaker signature, they just wouldn't necessarily look for a weaker signature, which had bought him time. Rhys used what little time he had left to scour the area, searching for any hint of Lyra. At the very back of the area, up against the ravine wall, he finally felt a hint of Lyra's aura. He looked around, scanning the buildings, the sky, the floor, and there he finally found her. Her aura was below him, deep underground. He wandered closer, peering toward a narrow crevasse. At the bottom of the crevasse was a well, and at the bottom of the well was a woman in white. "Lyra," Rhys hissed. Lyra snapped around, looking directly up. "Rhys, what the hell are you wearing? That's not important. Are you safe down there?" She looked around her, a bemused expression on her face. "I'm not in immediate danger." "Good." Then, a hand closed around the back of his collar. An enormous figure yanked him backward. He found himself staring up at a silhouetted face, the figure's eyes narrowed. "What is this? Have I found our little mouse?" The figure murmured. "I am no mouse," Rhys declared. He twisted in the figure's grasp, exerting his Tier 3 strength. Landing on his feet, he drew the first broken sword and brandished it at the man he saw now. The man was huge, bulging with muscle and at least 8 feet tall, with the same cruel smile as the other brothers he'd defeated. Rhys narrowed his eyes. "Don't tell me. Does your name start with L?" The man looked shocked. "How did you know?" "Call it a hunch," Rhys replied. "Do I have the honor, then, of facing the eldest Waters brother?" "Landon Waters, at your service," the man rumbled, bowing just a tiny amount. "Knew it," Rhys muttered to himself. "And who do I have the honor of facing? What foolish mouse has scurried into my house? My name is Rent." With dramatic flair, Rhys threw the hat into the air, revealing his blood-splatter makeup at last. Landon raised his brows. "Did you have an unfortunate incident with a bottle of marinara?" "No, I was too busy with your mom." "Don't let anyone say I'm not a giving lover," Rhys replied, and charged at Landon. Rhys would have liked to keep the banter up for a little while longer, personally, but there was no time. The other high-tier signatures were rapidly approaching. If he waited any longer, he'd be fighting not one, but 3 Tier 3 fighters. It looked like 2 at once was inevitable, but if he and Landon fought now, 3-on-1 should be preventable. So he charged, closing the gap between him and Landon as fast as possible. Landon was huge. Enormous. 8 foot nothing and at least 600 pounds of pure muscle. He didn't carry a weapon. It was quite transparently obvious that he didn't need to. He saw Rhys coming and didn't budge, except to smile. "Oh, fuck." Rhys's sword, trash intent and all, struck the man in the shoulder and bounced off. The blade didn't so much as scratch the man's skin, not even the intent part. Rhys stumbled backward, shocked. No one had ever shrugged off trash intent like that. Just tanked the hit like it was nothing. Landon was a Tier 3, just like him, but it didn't feel like they were the same tier. Not the way Landon could totally ignore his hits. Rhys whirled his blade and stepped back, eyes narrowing. He sheathed the sword and bared his hands, flexing his fingers. Looked like pretending to be a swordsman was over. It was time to get dirty. "Giving up?" Landon mocked him. "Not at all. I'm just getting started." "Wonderful." Because I haven't started yet either. Rhys bit back the urge to shout no shit, Sherlock, Landon hadn't moved at all yet. Still, it seemed like a waste of effort and breath, especially when the man was clearly winding up for a strike. Rhys jumped back, throwing his mana toward blow mitigation for the incoming hit. This was going to be a big one. He realized, fractions of a second later as he was flying backward through the air, that he had under and overestimated several things. 1. He'd thought Landon was strong and big, but that was it. That was wrong. There was no it about being strong and big. Landon was strong and big, and holy fuck, was he in trouble. 2. That the upper limits of blow mitigation were far lower than he remembered, probably due to him not using the skill much since Infinite Constellation. Several ribs were broken. He could feel the sickening sensation kicking in now, along with the unfortunately familiar held breath sensation of adrenaline holding back his pain. A numb part of himself activated Trash Body to prolong his future moments of consciousness for as long as possible. 3. As his back hit the ravine wall in a cloud of dust and shattered rock fragments and all the air left his body, that he could hold out against Landon for any amount of time without using his poisons. What had he been thinking? Wanting to test his strength against other Tier 3s. What kind of non-trashy thought process was that? He wasn't he kind of guy who could take someone else out without cheating, so why hadn't he immediately opened with a cheat? Foolish. Conceited. Deadly. He slid down the ravine wall, still uncertain about that last one. His vision flickered as Landon approached, stepping over the crevasse that Lyra was trapped at the bottom of. Rhys struggled to sit up, but even with Trash Body, that was proving more difficult than he'd expected. Why'd I think this was going to be easy, again? Oh, right. Because all his little brothers were pushovers. Landon's paw of a hand landed on his shoulder and hauled Rhys upright. Numbly, Rhys took his feet once more. Landon nodded at him, approving. A warrior should die on his feet. You'd be surprised how many people in your position break down weeping and refuse to stand. I ought to commend you, he stated. You know, it's only because I have a specialized skill that I can stand. You broke a lot of my bones just then, Rhys informed him. He was starting to regret not bringing backup. Or was he? Even if he'd brought backup, what could anyone else do? They were all Tier 2. He really was their single strongest unit. And right now, he was feeling profoundly like the final tank standing in a hopeless battlefield, after all the other units had already died to the brutal turn-based world of Flame Crest, watching the warriors approach and knowing he could prolong total defeat, but couldn't win this map anymore. Hey, how do I quit out and restart the map? Anyone remember the buttons? I need my units back. And my HP, for that matter. He'd be a weird Flame Crest unit. One that could use broken weapons better than normal ones. Like some variant of a unit with Spendthrift, the skill that let units extend the number of uses weapons had before they broke. But backwards. Was there a skill that let units use weapons fewer times, but do more damage while they lasted, in that game? It felt like there should be, but he couldn't remember. You're drifting, Rhys. Snap to before the big guy punches you in two for real this time. The fist was already hurtling toward him. Rhys narrowed his eyes, forcing himself to focus, and put his all into kicking off the ground. The fist blew past him, totally missing him, but the wind from the fist spun him around anyways. He stumbled, and probably would have fallen if not for the pile of discarded chicken bones under his feet. Rhys had never felt so grateful to greasy chicken bones in his life. He wasn't sure he could get back up if he fell right now, after all. He waved his hand, calling forth a bladed scrap of impurities. With all his strength and mana, he threw it at Landon's face. Landon leaned to the side. He snatched the dart out of the air as it buzzed by his face, then opened his palm, looking at the little scrap of black filth squished in his hand. He laughed. What is this? It feels dangerous. Rhys stared. That wasn't possible. Landon wasn't affected by impurities. At all. How? He'd never. That wasn't possible. Startled. My untarnishable gold skin prevents poisons from afflicting me. Ah, are you a poison master? My apologies. Your poisons won't be able to affect me. Skin. Rhys's ears perked up at that. Only your skin. Would you like to test it? Landon offered, suddenly considerate. Rhys frowned. That wasn't a good reaction. He doubted his poison gas attack would have much effect with that kind of offer. Landon could be bluffing, but he seemed more likely to be earnest. I don't have much time. I don't have many moves left. I need to pick the things I do from here on out wisely. Testing things was no good. Anything but sure kills were off the table. He'd just been defending drawn-out, slow escalation battles, but now he could no longer hold back his aces. If he kept them up his sleeves now, he'd simply die with a bunch of cards on his body. But what sure kills do I have? A thought came to him, and Rhys's eyes widened. No, no, no. I just said that I can't experiment. I can't do it. I can't risk it. But if it works. He racked his brain, fighting to think through the pain. Nothing came to mind. Impurities were a gamble. Poisons too. Even his ultimate potion, he didn't know that he'd be able to get past Landon's resistance. The Sun Sword, it could probably defeat Landon, but could he land a hit before Landon crushed him or the Sun Sword? Landon was big, fast, and strong. Rhys didn't like his odds against Landon's physical stats. The guy had obviously cultivated his body, and why not, in the Empire, where the Empress could snatch your core at any moment. She could take his core, but not his body. Even without a core, he'd still be a force to reckon with. It was a shockingly wise decision. A shockingly wise decision that left Rhys with shockingly few options. The man was stronger, faster, and bigger than him, with an immunity to impurities and poisons. Trash intent was meaningless. A physical attack was foolish. Likewise, any ranged spell risked Landon dodging it. His curses weren't strong enough to significantly debuff or injure Landon. That one idea appeared again. Rhys grimaced. Damn it, I don't have another idea. He pulled a jar out of his storage ring, a grim expression on his face. Landon looked at the jar and frowned. Your final meal. No. Yours, Rhys said, and threw the marinara on the man. It was old, half-rotten marinara. He'd discarded it on the farm long ago, sitting on the side of the plants. When he'd retrieved the Sun Sword and the filth potion, he'd seen it sitting there and thought he might be able to brew it into something later, but desperate times called for desperate measures, and now Landon was blinking at him from under a layer of rotting, moldy tomato sauce. He lifted a huge paw and wiped his face. I hope you enjoyed that final laugh. He advanced, his footfalls enormous, his face stormy. Ha ha, Rhys deadpanned. He surged his mana, focusing on the tiny seeds mixed into the rotting tomatoes. Rhys poured his trash intent into them, calling out to their desire to grow, their need to sprout and develop. Most of them didn't respond. They'd been cooked, then left to rot for 3 years. There was little left of them, intent or no. Come on, come on. Landon stomped closer. He loomed over Rhys and drew back his arm. His hand curled into a fist, everything moving in slow motion as Rhys's adrenaline surged. One of the seeds stirred. A trash intent sprout uncurled from the tiny white seed, and trash intent roots sought earth. Rhys's mana poured out of him, struggling to support even one seed. The undead tomatoes took far too much energy to grow. He couldn't grow them, but Landon could. The roots twitched, then surged into Landon's perfect no-poison skin, or whatever he'd called it. They sucked tight to the surface of his shoulder, pulling vitality out of Landon's body. As the vitality left the surface of Landon's skin, the roots burrowed into the weakening surface and plunged into Landon's blood. Landon noticed the tomato seed at last. He turned to look at it, just as Rhys turned his attention away. That tomato was self-sustaining now, sucking Landon's strength away all on its own. He poured his mana into a different receptive seed, setting it off. As Landon ripped the first plant out of his shoulder, a second one burrowed into his chest, and a third snaked to life on his back. All over his body, ghostly seeds sprouted and burrowed in, greedily devouring Landon's life and vitality. Landon slapped them away, but Rhys could trigger them faster than he could pluck them, and dozens of them were growing on Landon's body even now. Landon whipped around. He glared at Rhys. All I need to do is squish you, and these plants die. Rhys smiled slowly. Landon's vitality wasn't just flowing into the plants, but through them, and into Rhys. Under his bloodied robes, his body healed. Carefully, he directed the vitality to his legs and hips, fixing the worst of the damage to his running infrastructure. He knelt subtly, preparing to leap away, and gestured Landon on, a smirk on his face. "Yeah, come get me, big boy." Landon lunged. Rhys bounded away, laughing aloud. "Too slow. Gotta move faster." Rhys leapt away. His bones creaked and his joints ached, but the quick patch job he'd done to heal his legs held for now. He needed more time to let self-regeneration properly patch him up, but right now, between Trash body and the vitality he was stealing from Landon, it would have to do. Landon smashed down where he'd been seconds later. Earth flew, stones peppering the back of Rhys's legs and pinging a few tender spots he hadn't known he'd had. He'd given up on plucking the vines to just attack Rhys. Clearly he'd decided killing the caster would be faster than pulling out all the vines, as the vines themselves grew deeper into him and new ones spawned with every moment. He whipped around and lunged at Rhys, and Rhys yelped and hopped into the air. Landon followed up with an uppercut, only for Rhys to snap snake robes, whip out from under his sleeves and whip it viciously at his arm. The blow still hit, but Rhys adjusted his position and lowered the damage with the swipe. His bones broke, and he flew backward, but managed to land on his feet. A few seconds later, more vitality flowed into him and repaired him, and he ran on. Landon chased, still trying to kill him before his vines could deplete his strength. He wouldn't be wrong about killing the caster being the quickest way to escape, except that the more the vines grew, the more vitality Rhys stole from him. Rhys healed and grew more rejuvenated, and Landon grew weaker and more exhausted. Rhys fled, and Landon chased, but the scales had already been tipped in Rhys's favor. The longer Rhys kept up the chase, fleeing fearfully as though his life were on the line, the worse things got for Landon. Rhys slowed his own reactions and speed, letting Landon get a few hits in here and there so the man wouldn't swap tactics. Better to take hits he knew he could survive, than for Landon to whip out some sure-kill ultimate technique and OHKO him. As he fled, he watched the vines on Landon's back. The buds were swollen, and starting to show the first signs of the red fruit that would come. Landon didn't have enough vitality to instantly create tomatoes the way Rhys had, back when he was dealing with mana oversaturation back in Purple Dawn, but he had enough to create tomatoes. Rhys just didn't know how many, or how long it would take. With all the vines currently digging into Landon's flesh, there was every possibility that they would kill the man long before he produced even a single tomato. A tiny bit of Rhys realized he'd gone from terrified of Landon to wondering if he'd have a good crop this year in the space of a few seconds. He wanted to laugh but he didn't want to give up the ghost, so he forced himself to keep looking terrified and run around like his hair was on fire. Good things couldn't last forever. Landon's face darkened, and he halted, lifting a finger to point at Rhys. "You're toying with me." "Me? Would I do that?" Rhys asked, putting on a shocked face. Landon drew back his fist. Mana gathered around it, only in Rhys's mana senses at first, but quickly growing stronger, brighter, until his hand was encased in a wall of blue fire. The power emanating from his fist took on a terrifying tenor as he put everything he had left in it. His body withered, and even the tomato plants growing from every inch of him drooped. "It's too late to stop you. But like this, I can kill you before I die." Rhys's eyes widened. That punch, no matter how hard he fled, it was too late. Not just for him, either, but for Lyra and the whole camp, too. Landon had given up. This was his last gambit. Not the tomatoes. Even as he outwardly panicked, a part of Rhys remained calm. He focused on the tomatoes and made a grasping gesture. The tomato plants extended their roots, seeking deeper into Landon's body. Without Landon making an effort to force them back, they sunk deep into his flesh and sucked up every last scrap of vitality and mana he hadn't already put in his punch. Further, the roots dug through Landon's body, racing toward his fist. Landon laughed, a dark and desperate sound. "It's too late. You cannot stop me." He raised his fist one last inch, then changed the momentum to forward. Rhys gritted his teeth. He hadn't wanted to use this, but he had no option. I have to trust Sable. Sable would know what to do. He called on the curse, the one he'd left under the tavern, closing in Leonard. It responded immediately, unable to follow his will at this distance except to do what he needed the most in this moment, return to him. As Landon's fist hammered down at him, he threw his arm out, casting it out once more. Two icy, bony hands pushed out of the earth and grabbed Landon's arm mid-swing. Landon kept punching. The bones shattered. Rhys felt something cold and unpleasant lash against his very being, but it didn't matter. The roots of the tomato plants had reached Landon's fist, and they greedily sucked up all his remaining power. Beautiful tomatoes bloomed on Landon's back as Landon himself was transformed into a weak, near-skeletal being. He stumbled, then dropped to his knees. Rhys walked over and put his hand on the man's shoulder. You know, I was really scared for a minute there, but then things started working out for me again. I actually thought you had me, though. Good job. Landon hissed one last breath, then fell onto his face, dead. Rhys quickly collected the tomatoes from Landon's dead body and tucked most of them into his core, chewing on another. He raised his brows, a little shocked at how adaptable he was. He hadn't thought himself capable of peacefully eating human tomatoes, but then again, he'd eaten his own. Why not these? They kinda taste a little coppery, though, Rhys thought, and then coughed. Something thick and red splattered on the ground in front of him. Huh. He lifted his hand to his face. Blood poured from his nose, his eyes, even his ears. He coughed again and turned his head, spitting up blood. His entire mana infrastructure shook, down to the trash star. He frowned at the blood for another second, then realized, it was backlash. Backlash from the curse. Still, was this all? People acted like curses were horrific things, but this wasn't much worse than the backlash from any old broken spell. Darkness obscured his vision. All the power drained from his body. No, it had never been. Nothing but another daydream. A whip snapped. Back to work, prisoner. He moved numbly. Calloused hands gripped a pickaxe. He coughed, a dry, hacking sound. Worn down. There was nothing left within or without. He was a husk, nothing but an empty husk, and this was his life, his future, his past. Breaking free of the Empire. What a foolish dream. He would never break free. The ball of impurities in his core grew larger as he hammered at the wall. He drew them in. There was only one way out. His plan, it was no plan. He had no hope. All he was doing, was speeding his own exit from this final torture. What a waste of a life. At least his first life hadn't involved physical labor to the death. If only he were back there, slaving away for some faceless corporation in the privacy and comfort of his own home. No. Wake up. Wake up. This was no dream. How many times had he tried to rouse himself from this nightmare, to no avail. No matter how much he wanted, this was all that was left for him. This rock wall, until the end of his life. Cold water splashed in his face. Rhys physically staggered back. The stone wall faded from in front of his eyes, and he found himself standing in the middle of the Water Syndicate's camp once more, not far from the ravine. Don't fall in. Pull me out. Rhys shouted, annoyed. Rhys shook his head. He rubbed his face down, wiping off a layer of cold sweat that hadn't been there moments ago. So that's what a curse's backlash is like. Not just physical harm, but pulling out the worst moments of his life and trapping him back in his darkest times. He shuddered. I never want to go back there. Never. He'd been keeping busy all this time. Not letting up. Not letting the memories sink in. But there was something there, wasn't there? Something he'd locked away and hadn't confronted. Something he refused to deal with. And I'm just going to keep on being trashy and not deal with that, Rhys thought to himself firmly. He reached into his storage ring and pulled out a bunch of trash, chaining it together with a little trash enchantment. He lowered it into the ravine, and Lyra clambered up it. Thanks for coming to get me, by the way. You didn't have to. No, I did. Lyra squinted at him, but Rhys didn't explain. His heart still pounded in his chest from what he'd been shown by the curse backlash. A part of him realized that the whole importance of his people thing came from that experience, from not wanting to leave anyone behind, while another part of him wanted to race to the next camp and tear it open as soon as possible, so that no one else had to suffer for another second. He took a deep breath. Now was not the time. First, he had to solidify his hold over the water syndicate. Only when that was firm as rock could he move on to continuing to free camps. 2 mana signatures had almost reached him and Lyra. He took another bite from the vitality tomato and felt his energy surge. His injuries rapidly healed, and though he wasn't in perfect shape, he was better than he'd been before the tomato. He pulled out a second and a third, offering the third to Lyra. Need some strength. Thanks, Lyra said. She took a bite of the tomato, then frowned. Where'd you get these? Just a bit of casual farming along the way, Rhys said vaguely, not looking at Landon's withered corpse in the corner. Internally, he was still struggling not to fall back into that empty despair from the mines. He rubbed his chest, far too conscious of his pounding heart. That hadn't just been any day in the mines, that had been one of the worst days. One of the days where he'd almost given up. It wasn't like him at all. He wasn't a quitter. Never had been. But there were days, deep in the darkness, when he thought he'd never see the sun again, and not at the hands of the guards, but because he was just so weary. So ready for it all to be over. So ready to sleep, and never wake up again. A hand on his shoulder. Rhys jolted, but it was just Lyra. Are you okay? You've been acting weird since you got me out of the crevasse. Are you mad? It's not you. It's not you, he repeated, softer, realizing he'd been a little too firm the first time. He wiped his face again, trying to center himself. It's been a long day. I'm tired, that's all. Should we run away? Lyra asked. No, I'm not going to give up here, Rhys said, though he wasn't sure whether he meant it about now, or about life in general. Was it just the curse's backlash? No, that felt over, by now. The curse had run its course. This was all him. His own fears and doubts, that he'd been deliberately not prodding at. And I'm gonna keep not prodding them. Therapy was for the clean and healthy. Rhys was going to bottle up his fear and trauma until it became something truly toxic, and then. Wait, can I weaponize that? There was no more time to think. 2 signatures closed in on him and Lyra at speed. Lyra spun her wrist, and the slender blade leapt out of her bracelet umbrella. Rhys drew his broken sword. Together, they faced toward the onrushing signatures. 2 tier 3 mana signatures closed in on them, looping toward them from either side. Rhys devoured another tomato and pulled out a third, eating it so fast that tomato juices ran down his face, mingling with the red face paint. He still wasn't 100%, and even if he ate all the tomatoes, he wouldn't be. He needed the slow, regenerative power of self-regeneration to set everything right. The tomatoes were just patching him up, lessening his pain as much as possible and keeping his body moving. Trash body was still active, and for a reason. He was still fucked up on the inside, emotionally and physically, but mostly physically. When he let self-regeneration fix him over a long, slow night, it set his bones right and adjusted what needed to be adjusted. The vitality tomatoes were more like a band-aid. It kept him upright and kept him from bleeding, but that was it. He could feel that his bones hadn't set right, and several of his organs felt trampled on and messed up, but he could keep fighting, where he'd been ready to conk out before. He needed to rest and recover, but for now, he could keep going. All the low-tier mages had backed away. They hadn't outright fled, but watched from the edges, curious about how this would end. Rhys had a feeling that this was not the first time this particular troop of criminals had had a violent change in management. No one seemed too concerned, especially since Rhys hadn't been aggressive toward any of them, only toward the upper echelons of their structure. It explained why all the other mages he'd taken over had gone along with his wild new plans so easily, or half of it, anyways. The other half, he figured, was the Empire. They'd struggle to survive in the wild, as it were, without someone protecting them from the Empire. It was safer to align themselves under a boss of sorts, who knew how to keep their magery on the down low. As long as Rhys could provide that protection, he was just as valid as the Water Syndicate to most of these lower-tier mages. Really, these were probably exactly the people he needed for his fight. People who didn't particularly like the Empire, or at least weren't excited about it. People who wanted to do their own thing, not be held to someone else's standards and cultivation techniques. There was no reason to harm them just because they were temporarily part of a criminal enterprise. They'd be recruited to his cause soon enough, whether they wanted to be or not. They aren't told about my glorious purpose. They don't find out about anything we've set up so far. This part of the enterprise stays separate from my tight-knit group of rebels. Still, his chip and fries empire needed manpower, and if fast food in his world had taught him anything, it didn't matter if that manpower was underpaid and would rather be anywhere but at their job. All they needed to do was show up and do enough work to pass it off as a desirable product, and that was enough. Two figures sprinted out of the forest, closing in on Rhys from either direction. One, a man who had the Waters family shoulders, the other, a woman who had the Waters family jawline. Their eyes blazed with anger. "Are you the one? The one who's been killing all our sons?" The woman shouted. "You dare come here and fight us in our homes? Is killing our sons not enough? I didn't kill all your sons. Leonard is still alive," Rhys informed them. "Also, you sent your sons after me. What was I supposed to do, keel over and die so they could live?" "Silence. You die, here," the woman shouted. "Leonard, you had to leave that fool alive." The man grumbled. There would be no reason to be had here, that much was clear, so Rhys decided to take a different tack. They were being unreasonable. Why not be unreasonable back? "That's right. Now that I've killed your sons, I'm going to kill you, and 7 generations of your family, at that." The woman gasped as if it was a real threat Rhys could actually enact. Given his lifespan, he could hang around for 7 generations, he supposed, but that would require Leonard to do a lot of breeding. If 7 generations of their family were still alive, then the eldest members would be far more powerful than Rhys could reasonably defeat, and it was a ridiculous threat in a different direction. Either way, he wasn't actually going to do anything like that, but it was a classic villain line. As long as the two of them were being unreasonable, he might as well shout fun lines and be unreasonable, too. "You wouldn't dare," the man snarled. "I've got a good start on it," Rhys informed him, rolling up his sleeves. "Come on. You two are the next generation. Let's get this party started. You'll regret those words." "Doubt it. Neither the mother nor the father had the same golden body thing that their son Landon had had. They were ordinary Tier 3s. The mother rushed Rhys, while the father stood back, casting some kind of spell. An aura appeared around the mother's body, and her charge grew even more savage. "Lyra," Rhys said quietly. Lyra nodded. She gestured, and her sword transformed into an umbrella. Water rained down all around her. She spun her wrist again, and the raindrops turned into a hail of sharp ice shards that hurtled at the father. As the ice closed in, Rhys charged to meet the mother. They met head-on in a test of strength. As Rhys expected, her natural strength plus the buff made her much stronger than him, but that wasn't why he'd wanted to clash. He opened his mouth, spitting a ball of invisible toxic gas in her face. Something told her it was coming, and she flinched back. Rhys pushed the attack, chasing after her and pushing the toxic gas toward her at the same time. She continued to back away, lips sealed, refusing to breathe in, but that meant that she couldn't recover or press the attack. While she focused on the gas, Rhys called a blade of compressed impurities into his hand. He released the sword with one hand, letting the clashing blades drift toward him, and stabbed her in the chest with his newly forged impurity blade. Impurities dissolved into her bloodstream. Her eyes widened, and her strength dropped precipitously. "That's kind of how I envisioned the fight with Landon going," Rhys thought. He knocked her blade back and took her head, then called the gas and impurities back into himself. Pausing a second, he looked down at her body. She'd been one of the heads of the local criminal syndicate. Most people would call her trash. Was it close enough to qualify? Only one way to find out. He knelt and put a hand on her body. It vanished into him, her mana kept separate from his trash star as usual. Rhys breathed out. He wasn't really shocked, but it was a nice confirmation. All her sons had counted, so why not their mother as well? But then, she was the leader of the criminal syndicate. He didn't know what, exactly, counted as trash or not, so he couldn't be sure. Across the way, Lyra was exchanging spells with the father. He fired off fireballs and strangely colored waves of light, which Lyra countered with splashes of water, while dodging the light waves and shooting spikes of ice whenever she could. Without overtly throwing himself into their battle, Rhys created a new dagger of impurities and threw it toward the man. While he and Lyra dueled, the dagger flew around through the air and came up behind the man, then darted into his back. The man bucked. Impurities flowed into him, and the veins on his face stood out, while his strength lowered and his casting slowed down. His eyes widened, and he whipped around, searching for the source of his weakness. The second he turned his back to Lyra, she sprinted across the field with supernatural speed and agility. Her eyes flashed, and her umbrella whirled back into a slender sword. She plunged it between the man's ribs, twisted, and yanked it free. Blood spouted out. The man gasped, clasping his hands to his chest. Lyra didn't let up. She grabbed his neck and kept stabbing, over and over, until he bucked and finally went limp. Rhys raised his brows. "Remind me not to piss you off." She ran a hand through her hair, inadvertently staining a section red. Her hands were blood-stained to her wrists. "Sorry. The prey drive overtook me. Are you hungry? I can look away." She looked at the man thoughtfully, then scoffed. "I'm not that hungry. But you did think about it." Rhys said nothing, but nodded. He crouched and absorbed the man, then turned to all the lower-tier mages around them. Some of them reached for their weapons, while others backed away, eyeing the exits. "Hello, everyone. Consider yourself under my leadership. If you wish to flee and throw yourself at the mercy of the Empire, or wish to step forward and duel, consider this your opportunity. Otherwise, welcome. Until now, you were attempting criminal activity for revenue, but that's a short-sighted, foolish endeavor. Instead, you should join under me. We'll grow potatoes and tomatoes, and get the whole empire addicted to junk food. What's in it for us?" One of the mages asked warily. "A decent wage, the same security from the empire you enjoyed under the Water Syndicate, and the freedom to pursue whatever you wish to pursue in between your working hours." Rhys tried. "There's no catch?" Another mage asked. "Not really. You'll have to do some honest farming, distribution, and research work, but that's it. I'm not here to make you submit to the Empire or anything foolish like that. I will ask that you stop your criminal actions, since they run counter to our image as a good, safe, family establishment, but that is all. You'll find chips are a much more sustainable and equally profitable effort as criminal activity. What I need the most is to expand my shops beyond the closest city. I assume I can count on you to assist me with that." A few of the mages looked curious. One or two walked away, but the majority stood around, curious. Rhys gestured. "Come on. I'll get you started, and then we can see what happens next. No need to commit yet. Once you see the money rolling in, you'll realize the truth of my suggestion." One of the mages laughed. "We'd be fools to run away from the strongest mage outside of the Empire. You're the boss now. If you want to grow potatoes, then I'll grow potatoes." The other mages nodded. Rhys raised his brows. He hadn't expected the survival of the fittest nature of this world to come into play here, but it wasn't like he was unhappy about it. Anything to make his efforts less difficult. He looked around the group and clasped his hands, beaming. "Wonderful. Then here's how we're going to start." He spent some time explaining to the Water Syndicate the basics of what he expected from them. The general mood in the camp went from tense, to confused, to totally lost. He hadn't expected them to get it right away, so he wasn't too bothered, though he was a little worried that they wouldn't be able to understand his vision for a long time yet, given how long it would take for profits to filter down. Still, at this level of parallelization, he had to spread to the next city, which he immediately delegated to his new underlings. Several of the criminals were more familiar with 3 of the other nearer cities, and those were put in charge of expanding the snack shack outward. The pill-making mages were the ones who took to his vision the fastest. He barely had to finish explaining what soda and chips were before they started up fresh batches of the drinks and snacks, eager to experiment with new flavors. You can keep working on whatever you want, too, as long as you make chips and soda, Rhys promised. The mages nodded, already lost in their work. He shrugged. Compared to making drugs, making chips and soda must take a minuscule fraction of their time. He'd basically just given them the freedom to do whatever they wanted, and spend more time on it. There was no downside to his new proposition. From what he understood, they were mostly the few who had managed to wiggle their way to magehood without the Empire's help. Mages who were smart enough to become mages even without the assistance of any tomes or teachers. Their progression was slow as a result, but they had a unique culture of cooperation and sharing that he didn't see often among mages. They had to claw their way to every advancement using every scrap of their brains, and they had all grown up in a setting of restricted information, where all of them had experienced the pain of not knowing what to do next. Instead of hiding all their knowledge away, they had instead decided to share, and so, though they didn't all share the same path, they shared the same foundational techniques. It was an interesting solution to their predicament, and one Rhys wanted to encourage and see where it went, though right now, that just meant letting them do their own thing. All in all, the scientisty, pill-minded mages were easy to handle. He spent the first night resting, and woke up in good enough condition to keep going. The criminals took longer to get on board with his plan. They weren't super psyched about their new futures as farmers versus criminals. Those who were involved in distribution and setting up storefronts in the new cities flaunted it in the faces of those who had to farm. Rhys went from store to store, making sure they were properly set up, then installed one of his original rebels in the store to make sure the criminals weren't skimming the money. Once money started flowing, he made sure the farmers were paid just as well as the criminals involved in logistics and distribution, which quieted everyone down some. The ones who were doing store work still looked down on the others, but the others didn't care when they were all making the same money. It took a little while for the smaller shops to start making money, but before long, several cities were addicted to coffee, soda, chips, and fries. Rhys stuck around long enough to make sure everything was on board and working properly, then retreated back to his stronghold to ponder his future, and what shape it took. He'd been right and wrong about the Water Syndicate. Yes, it was part of a bigger crime group. No, that larger crime group was not also the Water Syndicate. This was just a branch of the Empire's organized crime network, but much like the scientisty mages, criminals had to work together to survive in the Empire. Oh, sure, there were spats, fights, the occasional disembodied horse head in the bed, he was sure, but they all cooperated in a big, semi-coordinated network to make sure they didn't all get schwacked by the Empire. No one ratted on anyone else, that was a big part of their code, not even if they were deadly enemies. Those who did were considered worse than dead, and were subject to the kind of punishment Leonard had expected his family to subject him to. When he discovered that, he made a special visit to Leonard, now quietly on his farm, to find out why he had. Leonard had simply given him a look like it was obvious. There are things worse than being decored or a painful death. Curses are one of those things. Are they really that bad? Rhys asked, as a man carrying around 2 curses semi-successfully. Mostly successfully. That one backlash barely counted. Are you asking me that? Rhys glanced at himself, then back up. Yeah, they destroy you. They eat you from inside out. Even being exposed to curse energy decays your future potential, let alone being inflicted with a curse or attacked by one. Attaining a higher rank after being attacked by a curse, you might as well give up on it. Power, immortality, all evaporate the second you encounter a curse. I would feel bad for you, but you did kill my family. It's my one small consolation out of all this that your potential ends here. Rhys frowned. That's not accurate. There was an entire department at Purple Dawn devoted to experimenting with curse energy, and Sable and Wilbur both are above Tier 1, and didn't seem worried about advancing. Then again, these people had literally all information about magehood restricted from them. He shouldn't be shocked that they misunderstood the danger curses posed. But on the other hand, Rhys smirked. He wasn't going to go around advertising that curses weren't the super ultra ultimate danger Leonard thought they were. It made his casual use of curses powerful psychological warfare. What does that mean? Leonard said, narrowing his eyes at Rhys in suspicion. What does what mean? Rhys quickly schooled his face back into a neutral expression. That smirk of yours. Why were you smirking? I wasn't smirking. That was a fearful expression of loss for my own future. Leonard crossed his arms, then sighed and shook his head. Whatever. Just keep bringing me books. Rhys tossed him a salute and backed off. Although he'd put Leonard on a farm like he'd promised, he hadn't missed the implications of the Waters family's resident bookworm. It was a farm, yes, but it was also the research lab, and Leonard oversaw that, with Corey's oversight. Rhys himself was the ultimate pre-release taste tester and poison checker. At one point, Leonard had attempted to get himself some petty revenge with poisoned chips, but the sight of Rhys eating the chips with relish while making heavy eye contact with the man responsible had made Leonard rethink his alignment. Since that incident, Leonard had settled in and started to earnestly put his gifts to work. Most of the scientist mages knew him already, and they had mutual respect for one another, which was easier than Rhys trying to install a new leader over them, hence him overlooking Leonard's assassination attempt. To be fair, it wasn't a very good one. He wasn't sure the poison would have injured a normal Tier 3. Probably made him sick to his stomach, but not much more than that. Maybe inflicted some respiratory distress, if he was in particularly bad health. It probably would have killed a Tier 2, Rhys thought, on a day where he felt particularly charitable toward Leonard. It wasn't a bad poison. It was relatively competent, even. It just wasn't enough to do anything to Rhys, that was all. At last, everything was stable. Or at least, stable enough that Rhys didn't feel like he spent every waking moment running around the Empire on the various secret paths the criminals used, putting out fires across 4 cities. This whole time, he'd been neglecting one thing, one very important thing. He could get by passively, just making generic efforts, but it was starting to get too serious for him to ignore. Rhys retreated back to his original trash heap hideout and sat down, just thinking. My trash star is getting seriously low. I need a permanent solution. He could run around picking up impure wells. No, he intended to. But he wanted something less, high maintenance. Something where he could set it and forget it. One network of trash cans to rule them all. And on top of that, if he could create a teleportation network, that would be even better. He didn't want to spend all his time and his whole life worrying about feeding the trash star. He wanted it on automatic subscription, on perma re-up forever. He didn't know how long he'd be stuck in trash star only mode, but whether he was in core mode or trash star mode, he could always use more trash. He also wanted to work on weaponizing his trash mind attack he'd come up with in the last battle, where he threw his trauma at other people. I'll call it trauma dumping, but that could come after the trash can network. Rhys drew the woven trash basket closer to him. He crossed his legs and immersed himself in his core once more, contemplating the tome while he gazed into the abyss. Once more, he found himself immersed in the struggle, unable to perceive what he wanted to perceive, yet temptingly close to the breakthrough he sought. For a few hours, he sat there, lost in his thoughts, then at last he wrinkled his nose, emerging from his contemplation in frustration. He was getting nowhere this way. That slippery comprehension about attaching the void to something physical remained as slippery as ever. How did he get this to work? How could he make it make sense? The book helped, but it still made no sense, and he felt like he was missing something. Something obvious. Something staring him right in the face. He plunged back into his core and faced the void once more. He felt like he was on the cusp of something. This whole time, the sensation of being on the brink of an important comprehension had wiggled in his mind, temptingly close, yet unreachable. But wasn't that his fault? After all, he was here. Safely in his core, outside of the void. Rhys stared at the void, thinking deeply. That mysterious entity lurked right outside it, but it didn't necessarily immediately attack him. Not unless he did something to draw its attention. Like obtain comprehension on the void right in front of its face. Rhys crossed his arms, thinking, then furrowed his brows, his mind made up. He'd come this far from being trash. From treating himself as trash, from being willing to throw himself away and reforge what he'd lost stronger than ever before. He'd always been willing to do it with his body. Why hesitate to do that with his mind and consciousness? Sure, it was scary. Sure, he might lose himself. But with his body, if things had gone wrong, he would have died. If things went wrong with his mind, he'd go crazy, but he probably wouldn't die. Probably. Rhys took a deep breath. Shit, losing my mind is way scarier than losing my body. In his mind's eye, he saw a wreck of a man, little more than skin and bones, lying in a bed staring vacantly at the ceiling. He was old. A pile of wrinkles. His chin was starting to show a few hints of stubble, but otherwise, he was well kept. The live-in carer hovered around his bed, fixing up a few dusty old trophies and plants for no one to see. Say hi to Grandpa, a female voice encouraged him. Hi, Grandpa. No response. There was nothing left inside the body to respond. A heart beat, but for no purpose. The being inside had long since fled. Everything that had meaning had already died a long time ago, and the corpse was kept alive only by the automatic processes of its own failing flesh. Grandpa was dead. It would take another 3 weeks for his body to figure that out. Middle school was going by then, and so Rhys missed his funeral, because his parents wouldn't pull him out of school for something like that. You wouldn't enjoy it anyways. Just a bunch of old people talking. But he always felt like there was something he'd missed. Like the part of funerals that was for the living was the more important part, and he'd missed out on that. It had taken him years to come to terms with it, if he ever had. Rhys dragged himself out of that memory. He shook his head hard and looked at the void again. I don't want to lose myself. There's nothing more terrifying than that. But it was right in front of him. Now that he'd thought of it, he could sense it. The last piece of the puzzle was right in front of him, on the other side of that void. All he had to do was step through to the other side. And throw himself right in front of some enormously powerful incomprehensible being. Rhys took a deep breath. He recalled his perfect future, his beautiful world where he sucked up all the Empire's trash from the privacy and safety of his own home and could instantly appear anywhere in the Empire. It was worth it. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. He couldn't progress without being willing to trash himself. This time it was his mind, but that was just the way it was. If I think about it, I'm glaringly weak to psychic attacks. He hadn't trained his mind at all. Now that he'd thought of mental attacks, he couldn't help but think that they were a fertile field for other mages to use as well. Who wouldn't want to bypass their enemy's defenses and lay all their damage directly on their opponent's mind? His mind was weak. If he didn't train it, he'd have a trash mind and be vulnerable to all kind of mental effects, from illusions to mind control to purely mental damage. He'd end up like his grandfather, without having dared to take the chance to advance himself. Or he could take that step himself, and risk that damage at the chance of advancing by leaps and bounds. Rhys clenched his fists, firming his resolve. Better to risk and level up, than to not risk, and get taken out by a mental attack from left field later. That was right. It was a good idea. A great idea, even. He had to do it, or he'd miss out. Before he could think about it any longer, Rhys charged into the void. Rhys charged into the void before he could think about it any longer. He burst out of the confines of his core into a by now familiar darkness and immediately stopped. There were things in the void that he didn't want to encounter. No, he didn't even want to risk drawing their attention too hard. Staying close to the comfort of his core meant he could beat a quick retreat from the void if that being decided to take interest in him, especially an aggressive interest. The instant he entered the void, he knew he'd made the right decision. The words of the tome suddenly started slotting into place in his brain, and everything made more sense about everything. The void, the world, life in general. Whoa, some distant part of Rhys noted, I need to be careful. As he uncovered the truths contained within the tome, the realizations he made were adjusting not just his perception of the void, but his perception of the whole world. But how could it not? The void was so much. It was everything. Or rather, it was a lack of everything. It was the place where things could be, and the place where things were not. The enormity of it laid before him, stretched bare to the horizon. He, here, on the edge of the void, was the least of it, seeing the least of what the void had to offer. The void called to him. Further, deeper. This shallow end wasn't enough to comprehend all the book had to offer. Just a little deeper, and he could understand everything. Entering the void had given him such a boost, so heading into the depths of the void would surely only continue to enhance his understanding. A little further. One more step into the darkness. It wasn't that dangerous. He was still close enough to retreat safely. Just a little more. A little more wouldn't hurt. He hadn't sensed that terrifying being at all. It wasn't close. He could make it a little further before anything took notice. Rhys snapped back to reality as darkness closed in all around him. He spun around to find the spot of light that signified his core twinkling in the distance, far away from where he stood now. He shook his head, shaking off the remnant cry of the void, and raced back toward the light. It was like a siren's call, luring him deeper even now. He could ignore it easily enough when he was conscious, but the draw tugged at him, calling him deeper on an existential level. When he was lost in contemplation, it became irresistible. He hadn't even realized he was moving until he'd woken up, already almost as deep in the void as he'd ever gone. He couldn't sense the being he'd sensed last time, but then, he was pulling his mana in tight, trying everything he could to avoid drawing attention to himself. The pile of trash and excess energy oozing out into the void from his core drew more attention than him, but Rhys lifted his head and took it all in. From here, the trash, and his core, were nothing but a tiny pinprick of light in the void. Like a single star in the abyss of space. The void was so immense and so empty that he was infinitesimally tiny. Not even worth looking at. The being he'd sensed before could be right next to him, or billions of miles away, and it was all the same to the void. It had infinite size, and no size at all. It was a place where space didn't matter. Time barely seemed to. He didn't know if he'd been in here for the blink of an eye or 1,000 years. Hopefully closer to the former than the latter, but in here, time flowed so strangely that he couldn't be sure. Retreating to his star, he took a deep breath and settled in again. This time, though, he was ready for the siren's call, and resisted it passively. His comprehension on the void expanded, and he realized that his attempt to stick the void to something as though it was a material was misguided in the first place. The void wasn't something you could connect to something else. As an absence, it was naturally impossible to join to an object. No, he'd been thinking of it wrong. Too used to handling pieces of trash that were physical objects, and completely unused to handling trash in its concept form. As a void dimension outside of the regular confines of space, the void was more of a concept than an object. And when it came to connecting concepts to things, it was more important to imbue them than to join them. He didn't need to weave the void into the basket, he needed to imbue the basket with the void. Give it the void attribute, and make the basket more void-aligned so that the void and the basket resonated, and called out to one another. It was like activating trash intent, not using trash enchantment. But that was no good. He couldn't activate trash intent on something on the other side of the world. He needed it to be more like trash enchantment, something with a one-time cost and a permanent effect, or else it was, not completely useless but not useful, either. He could maintain one or two, maybe, at the most, maybe use them in combat to void people, but it would have the same limitations as any spell. Someone strong enough would be able to fight back, or even outright block the spell, and he wasn't sure that voiding people was a good idea, either, when his core was connected to the void. Giving living people direct access to his core didn't sound like a great way to start off a fight. No, I need something more permanent. Something that I can set and forget. Something I can cast 1,000 times, something that other people can't enter but trash can, something passive with a low ongoing cost. He twisted his lips, pondering the void in his basket at once. The void wasn't opposed to permanence. The void itself was permanent. It was just that connecting the void and an object was something like connecting matter and antimatter. The basket was something, and the void was nothing. The basket wanted to exist. The void wanted it to non-exist. That was all. Except that was all, wasn't an easy thing to hear when Rhys desperately wanted, that was all, to not be the answer. There had to be a way. Something he could do to make the existence and non-existence align. In his mind, the image of the basket hovered. The concept of the void superimposed it, and Rhys's eyes widened. That's it. That's exactly it. It was a basket. A basket had holes. Not all of the basket was existence. Some of it was non-existence. The concept of a basket itself had the concept of existence and non-existence baked into it, as an object with gaps and filled places in it. He could fit the void into the holes, and anchor it to the basket where the basket had existence. The basket's existence could anchor the void in this world, into existence, and in its non-existence, the void could lurk. It makes teleporting troublesome, but the trash should be no problem. The non-existence could suck in the trash into its gaps, and compress and break it down as it whisked it away. Absorbing trash that way was honestly more convenient, since the trash would get broken down on its way into his core, and he didn't have to worry about anything slipping into his core through the trash cans without him willing it. Anything living would get sliced to bits by the basket's crosshatches long before it got anywhere near Rhys. A brush on the boundaries of his mind startled Rhys out of his enlightenment. He scurried back into the light and out of the void, escaping the darkness and that strange being that lurked therein. He wasn't even sure the brush was the same being, or a being at all, or something that was close to him, but his lack of power in the void was frightening enough to send him rushing home. He'd gotten the basics of his comprehension down, enough to set up his void trash cans and start sucking all the Empire's garbage back to him as he distributed cans across the country, and that would have to be enough for now. As awesome as trash can-based teleportation would be, he didn't think he could easily solve the dice to bits problem that was very much not a problem for trash, and he wasn't sure that the void was the way to do it, either. Somehow, he felt like there was some other comprehension that would unlock garbage can-based teleportation, something that could only happen after he'd normalized and distributed garbage cans. He could already feel the concept tickling at the back of his mind, just waiting to take full form, but just like he could feel the concept, he could feel its incompleteness. Its lack of shape, the energy and power that he would need, but didn't yet have. His brief dive into the void had gained him an enlightenment, and he was eager to act on it. He hadn't gained 2 enlightenments, but then again, he was trash, not some world-shattering talent. 1 dive for 1 enlightenment was already impressive enough for him. Sure, he was disappointed that he hadn't gained the ability to teleport through trash cans, too, but he'd achieved his primary goal, so he couldn't be disappointed. Rhys rose out of his core and into the real world once more, finding his hands resting on the basket that would soon be his very first trash can. Recalling the sensation of the void, he ran his hands over it, feeling the trash it was built from, calling every element into his head. The shape of it, the way the elements wove together, the spaces where there was no basket. Those, he replaced with void. Not filled, because void could not fill. But replaced. Took out the emptiness that was there, and replaced it with a stronger emptiness, an emptiness so empty that it had a name of its own, the void. He closed his eyes as he did it, letting the sensation of the void and the trash in his hands guide his work more than his vision. When he finally replaced the final empty space with void, he opened his eyes. The trash basket looked, Rhys tilted his head. It looked normal, but not. He could still see through the holes and see the world on the other side. He'd been a bit worried that his garbage cans would have holes that allowed one to gaze into the infinite depths of the abyss, but it mostly looked like it had beforehand. If anything, it looked more empty for being connected to the void. An enhanced level of nothing stretched between the gaps of the basket. He'd woven the basket somewhat loose, being a lazy bum, so each gap was an inch or 2 wide. At their widest, the gaps were noticeably lacking in any sort of interference, as if they held the clearest air from the clearest day within, when what they really held was absolutely nothing. Smaller gaps were too small for anyone to notice anything, especially if they passed by, barely looking at the trash can. Honestly, even the biggest gaps were too small for someone to notice unless they went looking. Rhys set the trash can down, then glanced around. Over at the edge, some trash had fallen through the structure where someone had passed by and dropped off fresh trash from the city. He jogged over and grabbed a piece, then shot it across the entire room toward the basket. He wasn't very good at basketball, but that didn't matter now that he was a mage. It flew across the room and landed unerringly in the basket's center. Nothing but net, Rhys muttered under his breath. Even as it struck the bottom of the basket, the void hungrily ate it up, and a moment later, Rhys felt a tiny piece of trash materialize in the void just outside his core. The edges of his lips turned up into a smile. It worked. Trash can distribution was easier than Rhys had expected, but then, perhaps he should have expected it to be easy, when he'd already taken control of a multi-city criminal logistics network. The greatest portion of effort went into crafting the baskets, since he had to do that manually, and trash baskets had to be as large as public trash cans to be meaningful. Rhys went from having the same joking opinion about underwater basketweaving classes as everyone else did, to being of the impression that they should be mandatory for all college, if not high school students. Luckily, several of the mages in his repertoire, especially the ex-criminal kind, had basketweaving backgrounds due to having grown up as mortals in a medieval world, and once he pointed them at using materials from the trash, they were able to rapidly accelerate his basket-making efforts. He still had to add the void to the baskets, but that limited his efforts in the process to the very final step, so that Rhys could put all his effort into adding void, rather than building the entire basket from scratch. The chips, fries, and soda were mostly enchanted/enpotionated by people who weren't Rhys nowadays. He still stepped in to make a personal effort on the snacks associated with new cities, to make sure they got the good stuff for long enough for his brand to spread its name and get people hooked, but once he got them started, he could count on others to imbue them with the sense of enlightenment or whatever other magical qualities he required. After all, the whole point of the sense of magicality imbued in the snacks was that it was only a sense of magicality, not actual magicality, so it being trash intent or trash enlightenment wasn't important. Nor did anyone else have to worry about imbuing their path and accidentally giving other mages access to their enlightenment. The chips never enlightened anyone, and it was all nothing but smoke and mirrors, so it was safe for anyone to share their path through Rhys's techniques. The void baskets were different. No one else had access to the void like Rhys did, and the few who even noticed there was magic on the baskets couldn't quite describe what Rhys had done to them. Just that he'd certainly done something, so Rhys had to manually envoid the baskets. He didn't mind. It was something to keep him occupied, and the fact that he had to do something gave him an excuse not to do the 1,000 other things he could be doing, that were always nagging at the back of his mind. Like rescuing other people from the camps. I'm going to do it. I have to. I want to. But I couldn't do it too quick in succession. Too quick. One after another, and conditions would get worse, not to mention the Empire would lock them down far worse. It would happen eventually anyways, but he wanted to control it. Control how and when it happened. Now that he had bases in several cities, he could launch simultaneous attacks in a way he never could before. On top of that, he had manpower that he hadn't had before. True, he couldn't use all the criminals, but some of them were trustworthy enough, or hated the Empire enough individually that he could count on them for raiding the camps. Everything he'd done, including the trash baskets, was for the sake of fighting the Empire and freeing mages from the camps. He felt like he hadn't done enough because he hadn't directly gone to camps and fought to free them, but that wasn't it at all. He'd only been playing the long game. Building up his manpower, strength, and location so that he could attack more effectively wasn't a waste of time, and it wasn't a wrong decision to make. So why did he feel so guilty about it? Rhys sighed and rubbed his forehead, looking down at the void basket in front of him. He hadn't started feeling so weird about it until the curse backlash, or maybe until he'd started playing with the void. He couldn't be sure. He'd done them both at about the same time, so it was hard to untangle the effects of the two weird things he'd done that might mess with his mental state. On the other hand, I'm in prime shape to attempt that new mind attack technique. Rhys smiled, glad he'd been able to find the good in it all. Sure, it was a strange kind of good, but he'd take it. Who would expect a mental attack from a guy who mostly fought in melee, anyways? He knew he wouldn't. And an unexpected attack on a front where someone expected no attack was even better than an ordinary sneak attack. He had no illusions about the technique. It wouldn't be mind control, or mind influence, or anything even close to it. If it worked half as well as he hoped it would essentially be like spam mailing someone's brain. Or maybe forcibly making someone relive their own trauma, or maybe forcing them to live his. Whatever it was, it would be a blunt instrument. A momentary attack, no more, and no less. He didn't know if he was relieved or annoyed that his mind attack was kind of trash. No, he knew the answer, he thought, smiling to himself. Pleased. Very pleased. Who needed some difficult, finesse-based, ultra-detailed mind manipulation skill when he could just slap his opponents with trauma instead? Who needed to coerce an enemy into walking closer to a cliff when he could just trauma dump them and attack them in the momentary opening trauma dumping gave him? Who needed the moral quandaries of mind control when you could just mind punch someone instead, with no more worries than punching them in the face instead of the brain? It was the perfect kind of mental attack for a trashy guy like him. Plus, it eliminated the need for therapy. Why waste time and money on therapy when you could just toss your trauma at someone else instead? Quick, safe, and effective. Safe for me, anyways. And who else matters? There was one last thing that he was waiting for before he launched his multi-part attack on the camps, and that was his own weakness. He was low on trash. Had been for a while, and making the void baskets, while not mana intensive, exactly, they still used mana. Mana he had to burn trash to generate. The trash bins were coming online one after another, and the people of the cities were slowly growing used to using them, which gave Rhys that slow, steady stream of garbage he'd been hoping for, but the thing about the slow, steady stream was that it was slow. He needed time to let it pile up and refill the trash star. It was enough that he was coming out positive, gaining more trash than he lost to just live as a mage or create the void baskets, but it was still slower than if he ran around sucking up impure wells, or whatever else. Not one to rest on his laurels, he summoned his mount, aka the skeletal rider, and hopped into the guy's arms, then let the skeleton wander the forest in search of impure wells while he focused on building his trauma-dumping attack. It wasn't hard to call forth trauma. He'd endured a lot in the last 3 years, and there was plenty to stew on. He'd been trying not to, so this new approach was the hardest part for him. On the other hand, turning it into magic was surprisingly easy. His thoughts were trash. He wanted to be rid of them, and the memories themselves were shitty enough that the world agreed that they were filth. He couldn't manipulate his own mind and memories with magic. His own fears and self-worth kept him from doing that, even with his self-worth being what it was, but he could wrap those memories up and project them outward easily enough. He wasn't sure if he was relieved or disappointed when the memories didn't actually leave his mind. It wouldn't have made sense if they did, since he could think about something a near infinite number of times without forgetting about it, and in fact, the more he thought about it, the easier it became to recall it, but a small part of him had been hoping that this attack would steal his bad memories away from him. That it really would serve as cheap therapy. Well, I guess it can't be perfect. His techniques were all trash, after all. If this one turned out to be useful to him as an attack and as a way to heal his mind, it'd be too useful to be trash. He should have known such a thing wouldn't be possible. In all honesty, he wasn't even sure if the offensive part of the skill worked. The only people out here in the forest were him and the skelly boy. He didn't think the skeleton man had enough intelligence for him to traumatize it, and if he did, the last thing he needed was a traumatized cursed being. As for himself, he was already suffering from his own memories. He didn't need to do the mental equivalent of dick punching himself for fun. He wasn't devoted enough to the grind, maybe, or maybe he was a reasonable human being without a masochistic streak, but either way, hammering himself in his own trauma seemed like a bad way to spend his day. I'm already going to jump into toxic liquid later this afternoon, and that's if things go right. Surely that's enough punishment for one day. Still, he kept practicing the form of the attack, refining it as he went so that he could launch it at the first sign of intelligent life outside of himself. It didn't hurt to be as prepared as possible, in the event a training opportunity popped up, literally. He wasn't going to launch it on random citizens, he was in control of the local criminal element, and he wasn't stupid enough to attack the Empire out of the blue unprovoked, but maybe he'd run into some vicious monster in a shitty mood or something. He was an optimist, after all. There was always the chance things would align for him. Strangely enough, he felt something similar to curse power emanating from the technique the more he practiced it. It was an attack he'd modeled after the backlash of a curse, so he wasn't completely surprised, but he was still a little taken aback. He hadn't used any curse energy or anything else curse-related to create this technique. Nor had he done anything with the vibes of curse creation. There was no blood, no sacrifice. No straw dolls, nails, strange chanting and unusual candles, nothing like that at all. Just him, alone with his thoughts. The most terrifying option of all, Rhys thought, chuckling to himself. Joking aside, he really didn't understand it. Since he wasn't doing anything curse-aligned, that meant his attack had to align with the heart of what curses were at their core. He wasn't a curse studier, just a guy who was friends with the most powerful cursed being in the world and who habitually stole curses from other people. Okay, maybe I do have a background in curses after all, but even so, he hadn't set out to create a curse. He hadn't even had the inkling that what he was doing was curse adjacent. But the sensation he got from this technique gave him the vibe that he was creating a curse, or at least something curse-alike. Are curses created from negative emotions? It kind of tracked, except that he didn't know how the undead writer fit in, unless his creator hated him. Sable was kind of gloomy, but she could be bright, too, and Straw, the most powerful cursed being he knew, was a giant weirdo who was distant and inhuman at the best of moments, but certainly not a depressed mess like the idea of a being made of negative emotions implied. Rhys clasped his chin, thinking, then shook his head. He had an imperfect understanding, to say the least. He wasn't going to ponder curses and come to a wild new comprehension of a concept that Ernesto had devoted his entire elongated life to studying in the course of one afternoon. So instead, he just continued to focus on refining the technique, making it sharper, less mana-intensive, and more powerful. With each passing iteration, he packed in more bad memories, and got faster at packing the bad memories in. After all, he'd need to call up the trauma to dump in a heartbeat in the middle of a fight. He couldn't sit there ruminating over bad days for half an hour while his enemy beheaded him in 10 seconds. All the while, the skeleton carried him on, wandering through the forest on its own devices, following whatever invisible directive it felt that directed it toward impure wells. The two might have appeared peaceful, if one wasn't a giant skeleton and the other wasn't emanating a terrifying aura of directionless, unchanneled curse power as they wandered. They marched on. Or rather, the Skelly boy marched, while Rhys lounged in its arms like some lazy waste of space. He'd stopped pondering the new technique a while ago when the cursed energy seemed like it was about to hit critical mass, and the Skelly boy had stopped moving as a result. That was something to explore when he had lots of mana and was in a safe place, not while he was being carried around by a curse he was deliberately misusing on his way to pick up more filth and another curse. Instead, he was sleeping. It was a rare luxury for him, at this point. He'd spent the last few weeks working on getting his shops and trash cans up and running, and there was no time to relax or spend on himself. Even taking a nap was out of the picture. So, traveling, with nothing to do and a destination he'd arrive at whether he was awake or not, he napped. There was no one out in the middle of the forest to tell him not to, and nothing else he wanted to do was viable in the middle of the woods where he had nothing but himself and what mana he had left to play with. His mental attack/new curse was still in development, but he felt like maybe he shouldn't push it over the brink in the middle of the forest with his cursed companion and nothing, so he had all the excuses lined up to take a little nap. When he came to, he was standing in front of an impure well, the skeleton holding him numbly beside the putrid pool. "Thanks," Rhys said, nodding at the skeleton. He extricated himself and brushed off his robes, then paused, looking at the skeleton. One part of curse power was negative emotions, if his burgeoning technique was any indication, but that wasn't the beginning and ending of curse power, merely one facet of it. The skeleton would auto-seek impurities. True, maybe it auto-sought pieces of itself, since this particular curse was hidden at the bottom of the wells, but maybe it sought impurities. And even if it sought itself, it was hidden in impurities. The curse, in its pieces, had been stored in impurities. Impurities, what did they do? Disguise the curse, overpower its signature, keep the curse alive while it was torn into 1,000 tiny pieces. Putting the skeleton's untimely grave aside, he had plenty of evidence that impurities were tightly linked with curse power. Sable had been full of them, and Leonard had seemed to think getting cursed meant you were impurified, too, though Leonard knew so little about curses that Rhys felt like it was probably better to actively ignore whatever he said rather than listen to it. He looked at the skeleton. "What do you think, big boy? Are impurities important to you on a metaphysical level, or?" The skeleton said nothing. Rhys patted its shoulder. "Good talk." He dismissed it back into his core and considered the impure well once more. He took a deep breath. He needed the impurities, and with his trash star still a little low, he definitely needed this well. There was just something off about it. Rhys took a moment to examine everything. The well, the surrounding forest, his body, even the sky, but found nothing that would make him feel off kilter the way he felt right now. He frowned, then turned his attention inward. Was it his mental state? Maybe. "I did just spend the whole ride here reliving the worst days of both of my lives, and then took a nap," Rhys thought to himself with a snort. If he was ever going to feel mentally wonky, now would sure be the time. He bounced from foot to foot at the edge of the well, gazing into its depths. Would being in a bad mental state affect his ability to absorb impurities? It was just a matter of sucking them into his core, right? All in the body. And the core. So, the metaphysical body. And he used magic to guide them there, and magic cared a lot about how he conceived of things and the way he thought of them. If his mental state was off, wouldn't he struggle to properly absorb impurities? He hesitated another second, then sighed. No way to know until he tried. With a spirit of experimentation around him, he dipped a toe into the filth and absorbed. Everything went good. The impurities flowed through him and into his core. The action was fully automatic now, so much so that he got in his own way watching himself absorb the impurities more than he improved the process by watching it closely. He frowned and crossed his arms, retreating his foot. Maybe it was fine. It was probably fine. His mental state was only a little wonky, and it was his fault it was off, so he was probably in relatively good state. Absorbing was automatic for him. He'd done it in all kinds of mental states, including right after he'd busted out of prison. Surely he'd be fine this time. Why am I panicking? Calm down. This is no big deal. Rhys huffed out, putting his hands on his hips, then shook his head at himself. It was like he was a little kid again, hesitating to jump in the pool because, "You don't understand, Mom, it's cold." He was an adult, and he was in good enough shape. He should hop in already. He'd be fine. Seriously, though, why am I panicking? Rhys took a deep breath and retreated a step. He sat down, folding his legs, and extended his aura around him. The environment appeared in his mind's eye, rendered in shining magic. Mana cared more about life than about anything else, probably because everything alive had mana, no matter how little. He saw animals wandering by, the birds in the trees, bugs, spiders, trees and underbrush, all of them lit up in bright blue. The impure well was a bright spot of mana, though that thick pool of mana was traced through with heavy blots of black, the black so heavy at times that it appeared as a dark hole in his mana vision, rather than bright mana. And just by the edge of the impure well was a human-shaped hole. Rhys sat there, eyes shut, continuing to pretend to meditate. He let his mana senses drift around, forcibly keeping himself from pointing all his mana at that human-shaped hole to examine it more closely. He pointed his mana anywhere but at the hole. Nothing, there's nothing there. I shouldn't pay any more attention to it. Not at all. No wonder he'd been panicking. He must have sensed the presence. He refused to think of it in any more clear words, in case it could read his mind, subconsciously, and been afraid of it. It didn't help that he was in a bad mental state, of course, but it wasn't psychology to blame for his racing heart and sudden apprehension for leaping into impurities. It was the invisible fucking person looming next to the impure well, pretending not to notice Rhys so Rhys could pretend not to notice him. But that left a big question in the air, an absolute elephant in the room. Did he walk away, whistling to himself, and pretend like he hadn't really wanted anything to do with this impure well, when he'd rocked up to it in the arms of the cursed skeleton rider who was locked in its depths and immediately dipped a toe in it? Or did he jump in and absorb it anyways, as if he hadn't noticed anything wrong? He could absorb impurities automatically nowadays, but absorbing a whole impure well, even if it was somewhat easy for him and he had no problem with sucking it all up, occupied all his effort and attention. If the invisible person had ill intentions toward him, he wouldn't be able to do anything to stop them from enacting them while he was absorbing the well. Then again, he'd barely been able to sense the invisible person in the first place. If they really willed him harm, couldn't they have acted before he figured out why he was so concerned? No, even if they acted now, he couldn't sense their tear. That meant they were so much more powerful than him that he couldn't properly gauge their strength. In other words, if they attacked him dead on in the light of day, he probably wouldn't be able to fight back. He was quibbling over nothing, because if they'd wanted him dead, he would already be dead. Unless they want this impure well for something, and they object to me starting to suck it down like a big, nasty milkshake. As effective an argument as, "I drink your milkshake," was when shouted at close range in a bowling alley. He was pretty sure that guy wasn't going to care how long Rhys's straw was or where it ended. This was his impure well, he'd been here first, and if he wanted it, then Rhys was the one in the wrong for daring to touch it, let alone the fact that Rhys was a fool for messing around in front of someone so utterly more powerful than him that he felt anxious. No, a borderline panic attack, just standing in the person's general area, when they had absolutely no interest in him at all, and weren't even doing anything about him. Rhys twisted his lips. Maybe I should just leave. Unless that person would be insulted by him fleeing their presence. Unless simply reacting to the fact that they were here pissed them off. He couldn't pretend he didn't want the impure well. It was already far too late for that. If he left, something had to have scared him off, and that invisible person would have a pretty good guess what had done it. He remembered his first life, and the irritation he'd felt at having others avoid him because his body was a little rounder than most people's. He understood, he really did, but at the same time, he desperately wanted to get out of this situation with his life intact. If this person was sensitive at all to others avoiding them, then he was fucked. Sweat dripped down his back. Rhys wiped his forehead and took a deep breath. Focus. Lock in. What am I going to do here? Retreating felt like the safest reaction, but also like the wrong reaction. If the figure, the silhouette, the presence, was trying to study the impure well, he couldn't exactly butt in. No, it would be incredibly rude too. Rhys took a deep breath and turned away once and for all. He'd find another well. The figure could have this one. A single cough. Rhys froze. He stopped dead, afraid to look, afraid to move, afraid to turn around. Time slowed, while his brain moved at double speed. It doesn't matter. The figure has acknowledged me. I have to turn around, or it'll be rude. Do it. Move. Slowly, he turned back around. There was a human being sitting where the silhouette had been. A man dressed in rags. They might have once been fine robes, but they were filthy and tattered now. Rhys smiled pleasantly. Hello. I didn't see you there. I know. Rhys's smile froze on his face. Was that not the right thing to say? You hate this empire, don't you? Rhys licked his lips. Out of the frying pan and into the fire right there. Seconds ago, he'd been afraid walking away might piss off this guy, and now, he had to answer a deeply political question that many people had strong feelings about. Yep, I'm fucked. So, you've noticed, he said at last, not sure there was a good answer to this question. Since there was no good answer, he could at least give a trashy one. Two faceless figures met in the woods. They spoke in deep voices about mysteries. No one understood what happened but the figures, and they walked away. Except in this case, Rhys also wasn't completely sure what they were talking about, and he really just wanted to get out of here as soon as possible. The man in rags sat up straighter. What if I told you I knew where this fragile ship shatters? Rhys stared at him. Utter silence. Wah, what am I supposed to say to that? Yes, please. Or is it some kind of test? No, thanks. Do I want to owe something to this weirdo? At least the guy didn't seem to want him immediately dead, so that was nice. He hesitated another second, then made a noncommittal grunt that could have made anything. It wasn't his best hooded badasses in the woods answer, but it was at least less funny than that time two hooded badasses sat on a dark beach and the standing one told the seated one that he was the seated one. Even the seated badass had laughed at that, though at the time, no one, not even the players, understood why. As long as this guy doesn't tack the wise to the end of his name, I'm probably okay, Rhys reassured himself. He watched the other man warily, taking close note of everything. The man had a handsome face with sharply defined features and dark hair with an oily hang to it that suggested it hadn't been washed in too long. He sat beside the well with a straight back and great posture, his hands resting in his lap. He didn't carry any weapons, but as the resident impurities and poisons user, Rhys didn't take that to mean anything. Who are you? He asked at last. The man cleared his throat. Perhaps I came on too strong. What if I told you how to find your friend? He nodded at the hilt of Rhys's sword. Rhys glanced down, only to find the tiny straw doll dangling there. It looked up at him with black button eyes, and they both turned to look at this strange figure as one. I would like that, Rhys said, on guard. The man nodded. He shut his eyes, and Rhys realized suddenly that he remembered nothing about them, but something about them struck him as strange. He opened them again, and he realized what it was at last. They weren't brown, but red, a dark, brownish red, like congealed blood. Back at your base, a man is being killed. The criminal element has not taken kindly to your little takeover. In pursuing his killer, you will find your friend. What? Who? Rhys asked, his heart suddenly racing. A second later, he admonished himself for reacting so strongly. He'd just told this man that he cared about his people. Sure, it wasn't as if he was super close with any male member of the mages. Corey was the leader of the ones he quietly thought of as the little guys, and Sable, Lyra, and Mouse were the more powerful members of the mages, the ones worth Rhys personally managing. At the very least, it was no one who he would deeply mourn, so long as it was a man, but on the other hand, these were his people, his responsibility. He needed all of them if he was going to free more mages from the camps. He couldn't afford to lose anyone right now, let alone someone this man considered worth mentioning. A second later, his heart skipped a beat as he realized the more important half of that statement. If he's not bullshitting, then this man knows exactly what's going on in my secret bases on the other side of the Empire. What? How? Who are you? He blurted out at last. The man let out a hollow laugh. You can call me a friend. Can I? Rhys muttered, mostly to himself. Would you rather call me an enemy? Their eyes met again. It was like gazing into the sun, intense and painful. Rhys looked away first. The man snorted under his breath. He put his hands on his hips. For now, our priorities align. Once you take down the Empire, we'll have to reconsider. But until then, I'm not but a powerless old man with a few words of advice for a strapping young mage like yourself. Bullshit, Rhys thought, but he didn't dare breathe the word aloud. Instead, he took a step back. Someone was being killed. He had to get home. Figure things out. Settle. Don't you need this well? Don't rush away. Sup of it first. The matter has already been dealt. If you run home now, the pawn will not be back on the board, and your power runs low, does it not? Rhys scowled. You know too much. That got a dry laugh from the man. Indeed. Knowing too much is all I have left. Rhys looked at the impure well, then back up at the man. You're really fine with. He spoke to nothing. The man was gone. Even when he extended his mana senses, there was nothing around him. No human-shaped holes in the flow of mana. Rhys ran a hand through his hair and shuddered, fear sinking all the way to his bones. Too close. Whatever that was, it was far too close to him. Those kinds of people should stay locked away atop mountains, running universities and institutions and staying far away from ants like him. He glanced at the impure well again, pausing to look around one last time. He shrugged. The guy had left it to him. If he didn't absorb it now, wouldn't that piss the guy off? And he wasn't wrong, either. His trash star was low. Not crazy low, but low enough that the thought of abandoning this well pained him. If he believed the man, there was nothing rushing home could do for him. His pawn, as the man put it, was already captured. If he didn't believe the man, then he was rushing home for no reason, because he had no reason to expect one of his people to die. Either way, he'd be better suited to take on everything if he absorbed the well, whereas rushing home now to attempt to save a life the mysterious man claimed was already taken would put him in danger, lower his mana, and mean he'd retreated from an impure well without gaining any further strength or trash for the star. If someone really had been killed, then he'd need all the power he could muster to chase after them. The equation was simple. No matter which way it tilted, whether he weighted it with a life, his fear of the man, or even his personal gains, the right move was to do as the man said and absorb the well. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, plunging into the gunk yet again. When he emerged, there would be trouble to deal with. But then, when was there not? He was a trashy guy. Trouble followed him around. And I suppose, if I get back and someone really is dead, then I'll know to take that man's words far, far more seriously. The impurities closed in over his head. Rhys sunk into the darkness, his mind on a future just as dark. As he gave himself fully to absorbing the impurities, one last thought shot through his head, foolish and trashy though it was. Damn it, I should have asked him if I could test my mental attack on him. End Book 3. For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic Audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.